It is said that in a laboratory on the edge of Manhattan, where the 19th century was dying and the 20th was not yet born, there existed a room that never knew true darkness. The gaslights burned through all hours not by accident, not by oversight, but by deliberate choice, as though whoever inhabited that space had made a covenant with wakefulness itself, had sworn an oath to remain forever in the light, forever conscious, forever standing at the threshold between human and something else entirely. Nikola Tesla stood at his workbench in that perpetual twilight, surrounded by copper coils and glass tubes and machinery that hummed with voltages that could stop a heart or illuminate a city, depending on how you channeled them. Around him, the world descended into its nightly rhythm. Across the street, windows went dark. In apartments stacked like honeycomb cells, families settled into beds, closed their eyes, surrendered to the oldest human practice, the temporary dissolution of consciousness, the aether death that prepares us for resurrection at dawn. But Tesla remained vertical, refused the ancient bargain, stood at his bench with eyes that had not closed, not truly, not deeply, in longer than most could imagine. 2 hours per night, he claimed when anyone asked. 2 hours of what he called rest, but refused to call sleep, as though the distinction mattered, as though by renaming the practice he could transform its nature, make it something other than the body's non-negotiable demand for darkness and dissolution. Some believe he slept even less, that the 2 hours was generous estimate, public fiction, the number he offered to those who would worry if they knew the truth. That in reality, his rest consisted of brief moments stolen while standing, while walking, micro-sleeps that ambushed him despite his vigilance consciousness flickering like a candle in wind, going out for seconds at a time before his will could reignite it. Beneath the silence of those long nights, beneath the hum of machinery that never stopped, lived a question that Tesla himself may not have been able to answer. Was this choice, or was this compulsion? Did he refuse sleep, or did sleep refuse him, his mind so electrified by visions, so populated by machines that did not yet exist, so crackling with insights about how to harness the invisible forces that move through all things, that darkness had become impossible? That closing his eyes meant confronting not rest, but chaos, not peace, but the overwhelming brightness of ideas that would not wait, that demanded immediate translation from imagination into wire and coil and experimental proof. The laboratory held its breath around him. In the corner, a Tesla coil stood silent, waiting for the current that would make it sing, that would pull lightning from the ether and make it dance like a trained creature performing for an audience of one. On the workbench, diagrams covered in his distinctive handwriting, half mathematics, half vision, the symbolic language of someone trying to describe phenomena that had no names yet, that existed in territories between the known and the impossible. Where memory fades and documentation grows uncertain, we are left with fragments of those nights. A neighbor's account of seeing his window glowing at 4 a.m, every morning, for months without variation. A colleague's recollection of visiting at dawn and finding Tesla exactly where he'd been left the evening before, not having moved except to fill pages with calculations, to adjust instruments, to pursue some insight that had arrived in the small hours and could not be postponed until the reasonable world woke to receive it. What happens to time when you refuse its most fundamental punctuation? Day and night are not just astronomical facts, but psychological necessities. The rhythm by which human consciousness measures itself, marks progress, creates the boundaries between yesterday and today and tomorrow. But in Tesla's laboratory, time became something else, something fluid, something unmoored from the sun's rising and setting, governed instead by the completion of experiments, by the mysterious cycles of inspiration and exhaustion that had replaced the natural alternation of waking and sleeping. He would work until his hands shook too badly to hold instruments, until his vision blurred and doubled, until even his formidable will could not keep his body upright any longer. And then, but only then, he would allow himself to recline, not in bed, not horizontal in the way sleep requires, but in a chair at his desk, surrounded by his papers and his machines, as though even in that brief concession to exhaustion he could not bear to fully leave the work, could not risk being too far from the bench when the next vision arrived, when the next impossible idea demanded his attention. 2 hours, maybe less. And then his eyes would open again if they had truly closed at all, and he would return to standing, to working, to the endless pursuit of understanding that had become indistinguishable from his identity. That was no longer something he did, but something he was. It is said that Tesla believed sleep was waste, inefficiency, an evolutionary remnant that consciousness would eventually transcend. He spoke of it this way, sometimes not with contempt, exactly, but with impatience, as though the body's need for rest was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome through sufficient understanding and will. As though the 8 hours that others spent unconscious were 8 hours stolen from the real work, from the purpose that mattered, from the discoveries that justified existence itself. But those who knew him, who saw him in those long sleepless years, sensed something else beneath the philosophy. Sensed that this was not choice masquerading as necessity, but necessity masquerading as choice. That Tesla could not sleep even when he wanted to. That his mind had become a machine that could not be powered down, that ran continuously whether he willed it or not, that filled every moment waking or the brief intervals of something like rest with visions of devices that did not yet exist, with mathematical relationships that revealed themselves in spirals and waves and geometric forms that seemed to breathe, to pulse, to insist on being brought into physical reality through his hands alone. Marked by the moon's passage across his window when he remembered to notice it, when the work paused long enough for him to register the external world at all the nights accumulated. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of hours when he stood while others lay down, when he remained conscious while humanity performed its nightly rehearsal for death, when he kept vigil in that gaslit chamber as though guarding something precious, as though his continuous awareness was all that held back some darkness more profound than the simple absence of light. What territories does the sleepless mind inhabit? What landscapes open only to consciousness that will not cease, that remains alert past the point where alertness should be possible, that crosses into zones where the boundary between perception and hallucination grows uncertain? Tesla saw things. Entire machines appearing before him, complete and functional, floating in the laboratory's charged air like offerings from invisible benefactors. He could examine them from every angle, could trace the flow of current through their ghostly circuits, could understand in an instant how each component related to every other. The alternating current motor arrived this way, the Tesla coil. Devices that would transform how humanity lived, delivered to a man who would not sleep, who kept watch through the hours when dreams should have processed the day's experiences, but instead found visions more vivid than any dream, more insistent, more demanding of translation into reality. Were these insights or symptoms? Genius or the mind's slow fracturing under the weight of exhaustion? The question has no certain answer. Perhaps it is the wrong question entirely. Perhaps what Tesla discovered, though he could never have articulated it this way, was that genius and madness share common territory, that the visions that change the world and the hallucinations that signal collapse may arise from the same source, distinguished only by whether they can be built, whether they function, whether reality confirms or denies what the sleepless mind has seen. The dawn would come, always. No matter how long the night, no matter how many hours Tesla had stood at his bench refusing the darkness, morning would arrive with its pale light, its suggestion that time had continued its forward motion despite his attempts to exist outside it. The city would wake around him. Windows would glow as ordinary people performed their ordinary morning rituals, having spent the night in that temporary death that prepares consciousness for another day of living. And Tesla would still be standing. Would have crossed another night without surrender. Would have added another day to the count of days he had remained awake while the world slept, alert while humanity dissolved into unconsciousness, vertical while others lay horizontal and vulnerable and utterly, completely at rest. But at what cost? This is the question that hangs in the morning air like mist, like smoke, like the ozone smell that lingered in his laboratory after high-voltage experiments. Had he transcended human limitation as he believed? Had he discovered that consciousness can operate continuously, that the body's demands are negotiable after all, that will and purpose can override biology's ancient rhythms? Or was he simply destroying himself? Slowly, imperceptibly, one sleepless hour at a time. paying a price he would not acknowledge, because to acknowledge it would be to admit that his great experiment, the attempt to remain forever awake, forever working, forever at the threshold of discovery, was not transcendence but error, not evolution but devolution, not the future of human consciousness, but the slow unmaking of one particular mind that had burned too bright, too long, without the mercy of darkness to temper the flame. Whispers tell us that in his later years, the price became visible. The trembling hands, the obsessive rituals, the difficulty distinguishing which of his visions could be built and which existed only in territories where exhausted consciousness mistakes phantom for reality. The gradual unraveling of the same brilliant mind that had once channeled lightning, that had seen how to make electricity dance to human will, that had revolutionized civilization through sheer force of insight. But in that moment, standing at his bench as dawn touched the window, having crossed another night without rest, Tesla could not yet see the cost, could only feel the familiar mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, depletion and purpose, the sense that he was doing something important even if he could not quite explain what or why. The gaslights still burned. The machinery still hummed. And somewhere in the charged space between waking and whatever strange territory Tesla inhabited instead of sleeping, between genius and its price, between insight and the madness that sometimes wears insight's face, lived a question that has no answer. Was he the man who would not sleep, or the man who could not? And does the distinction matter when the result is the same consciousness stretched past its breaking point, a mind that remained forever on, forever working, forever paying a price it would not name until the debt came due and could no longer be denied? Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain exactly that. Perhaps the boundary between transcendence and destruction is thinner than we imagine. Perhaps Tesla, standing alone in his laboratory as the sleepless night gave way to another day, was both transcendent and destroyed, elevated and broken, proof of human consciousness's extraordinary capacity and evidence of its limits, all at once. The light falls. The machines wait. And the question echoes through the decades that separate us from that gaslit room. What did Tesla see in all those sleepless hours that we, who surrender nightly to darkness, will never know? And should we envy him that vision? Or should we be grateful for the mercy of eyes that close, of minds that rest, of the ancient rhythm that Tesla refused, the nightly dissolution that keeps us human, that protects us from becoming too much like the machines we build, that offers the gift he would not accept, the temporary death that makes life sustainable, the darkness that allows light to return, the sleep that he would not take, and that, perhaps in the end, was the only thing that could have saved him from himself. Long before dawn touched the skyline, long before the first birds remembered their songs, and the city began its daily resurrection from the temporary death of sleep, Tesla would see things. Not hallucinations, he insisted. Not the phantoms that plague fever dreams or the shadows that dance at the edge of exhausted vision. Not dreams, certainly, because he was not dreaming, was not sleeping, was standing upright at his workbench with eyes wide open, fully conscious, fully alert, more awake perhaps than anyone should be at 3 a.m. when the world has descended into its deepest silence and consciousness normally releases its grip on reality's sharp edges. But visions nonetheless. They would appear without warning, without sound or fanfare or the gradual assembly that characterizes waking thought. One moment, the laboratory would contain only its familiar contents, the copper coils wound with obsessive precision, the glass tubes waiting to be filled with rarefied gases, the instruments arranged on benches in configurations that made sense only to him. And then, in the space between one breath and the next, something else would be there. A machine, complete, functional. Floating in the charged air of his laboratory like an offering from invisible benefactors, like a gift delivered from territories that had no coordinates in ordinary space. It is said that Tesla could walk around these phantom devices, could examine them from every angle, could trace with his eyes though never quite with his hands, because touch somehow broke the spell, dissolved the vision back into nothing, the flow of energy through circuits that did not yet exist in physical form. He could see how each component related to every other, how the whole system fit together with a precision that seemed too perfect to have emerged from conscious calculation, that suggested instead some kind of direct transmission from the realm where pure form lives, waiting to be incarnated into matter. The alternating current motor arrived this way. Not through derivation, not through the step-by-step process of hypothesis and testing and refinement, but whole, complete. Appearing before him in the small hours of a sleepless night as though it had always existed somewhere and was simply revealing itself to the one person awake enough, exhausted enough, displaced enough from ordinary consciousness to perceive it. The Tesla coil followed the same pattern. One moment, absence. The next, presence. The device hovering in his vision with such clarity that he could count the windings, could see where the secondary coil must nest inside the primary, could understand in an instant the relationship between frequency and voltage, and the singing resonance that would make lightning dance on command. Beneath the silence of those pre-dawn hours, beneath the hum of machinery that never stopped, and the faint sizzle of ozone from earlier experiments, lived a question that Tesla himself could not answer with certainty. Where did these visions come from? Some believe they were gifts. That Tesla, by refusing sleep, had stumbled upon a method for accessing knowledge that normally remains hidden. That the sleepless mind, pushed past its ordinary limits, begins to operate on different frequencies, begins to receive transmissions from what? The collective unconscious, the field of pure information that some believe underlies physical reality, the territory that mystics call the Akashic records, where every thought that was or will be exists eternally, waiting for consciousness receptive enough to perceive it. Tesla himself seemed to believe something like this. Spoke sometimes, in his later writings, of being a receiver rather than an inventor, of tuning himself to frequencies that others could not detect, of the universe revealing its secrets not through labor but through receptivity, through the willingness to stand in the darkness, literal and metaphorical both, and wait for what would arrive. But others, examining the same evidence, see something different, see symptoms rather than gifts, see a mind slowly fracturing under the accumulated weight of exhaustion. See the brain, deprived of the nightly processing that sleep provides, beginning to generate its own signals, its own phantoms, hallucinations so vivid they seem more real than reality itself. Modern neuroscience speaks of this phenomenon with clinical precision. The sleepless brain, after enough hours of wakefulness, begins to produce experiences indistinguishable from dreams, except the dreamer remains conscious, remains convinced of the waking state, remains unable to recognize that what they perceive has no external source. The boundary between perception and generation dissolves. The mind becomes both receiver and transmitter, both observer and observed, creating the very phenomena it believes it is merely witnessing. Which interpretation is true? Were Tesla's visions insight or symptom, genius or the first signs of the breakdown that would eventually claim him? Perhaps the question itself is wrong. Perhaps what Tesla discovered, though he could never have articulated it this way, is that genius and madness share common territory. That the visions which revolutionize human understanding and the hallucinations that signal cognitive collapse may arise from the same source, distinguished only by a criterion that seems almost arbitrary: whether they work. Whether the machine that appears in vision can be built in reality. Whether what the exhausted mind perceives corresponds to something external, or whether it is purely internal phantom, consciousness talking to itself in a language it mistakes for the universe's voice. Where memory fades into the uncertainties of historical record, we find traces of witnesses. Colleagues who visited Tesla's laboratory in those sleepless years and sensed something strange in the atmosphere. Not just the ozone, not just the electromagnetic fields from his experiments, but something else. A quality they struggled to name. As though the space contained more than its physical contents. As though presences moved through the laboratory that were invisible to visitors, but perfectly visible to Tesla, who would occasionally gesture toward empty air, would speak of seeing connections and relationships, and the flow of energy through configurations that existed nowhere except in his vision. One assistant, whose account survives in a letter written decades later, described walking into the laboratory at 4 a.m. to find Tesla standing perfectly still, gazing at something in the center of the room. The assistant saw nothing, just empty space. But Tesla was rapt, circling slowly, examining from every angle, occasionally nodding as though confirming something, sometimes shaking his head and making adjustments to something that wasn't there, at least, wasn't there to anyone but him. "What do you see?" the assistant finally asked, unnerved by the intensity of Tesla's focus on nothing. Tesla turned, seemed almost surprised to find he was not alone. "The motor," he said simply. "It's beautiful, can't you see it?" The assistant could not. Saw only the man, the empty space, the early morning light beginning to creep through the windows. But Tesla saw the motor. Saw it with such clarity that he would spend the next week building it exactly as he'd witnessed it floating in the laboratory's charged air. And when completed, when copper and steel had replaced phantom and vision, the motor worked. Perfectly. Exactly as the vision had suggested it would. This happened not once but repeatedly. Solutions presenting themselves fully formed. Devices appearing complete before ever being sketched on paper. The sleepless mind generating answers to questions that conscious calculation had not yet solved, that perhaps could not be solved through ordinary means, that required instead this strange threshold state where Tesla existed not quite waking, not quite dreaming, but somewhere between, somewhere dangerous, somewhere that most people only touch briefly at the edge of sleep, but that Tesla inhabited for hours, for days, for decades. Marked by these visions, his laboratory became more than workspace. Became threshold. Became the physical location where the boundary between inner and outer grew so thin it might not exist at all, where imagination and reality performed their mysterious dance, where consciousness pushed past its limits discovered territories that should remain hidden, that are hidden from those who rest, who sleep, who allow their minds to power down nightly, and never learn what strange lands open to awareness that will not cease. But at what cost? This is the question that haunts us as we stand beside Tesla in that pre-dawn darkness, watching him watch something we cannot see, something that may be insight or may be phantom, something that will either change the world or further fragment a mind already stretched too thin. The visions were real to him. This much is certain. Whether they were real in any other sense, whether they corresponded to something external, whether they accessed genuine information rather than generated convincing illusion, this remains forever ambiguous, forever uncertain, the kind of mystery that cannot be solved because the evidence can be interpreted either way, because genius and madness speak such similar languages that distinguishing between them requires criteria that shift depending on outcome, on result, on whether the vision produces fruit or only leads deeper into territories from which some never return. What price do we pay for seeing what others cannot see? For accessing frequencies unavailable to ordinary consciousness, for pushing awareness past the point where most surrender to sleep and discovering what waits in that extended darkness, that prolonged wakefulness, that zone where the brain begins to operate according to different rules, where perception becomes unreliable, where the self that observes and the phenomena it observes merge into something that cannot be separated, that exists only in the territory Tesla had learned to inhabit through his refusal of rest. Perhaps there is no answer. Perhaps Tesla himself did not know. Could not know because he lived inside the experience, because he was both the experimenter and the experiment, because the visions were all he had, and to question them too deeply would be to question everything. To admit that his great advantage, the sleepless vigil that allowed him to see what the well-rested could not, might also be his gradual undoing, his slow dissolution, the price extracted by consciousness stretched past its breaking point. The dawn would come. Always. The visions would fade as natural light replaced gaslight, as the city woke and the electromagnetic noise of a million human activities began to interfere with whatever frequency Tesla had been tuning to in the darkness. He would return to ordinary work building, testing, refining the devices that had appeared to him complete in vision, but required now the slow translation from phantom to physical form. But he would remember. Would carry with him the knowledge that somewhere in the sleepless hours, in the threshold state he had learned to extend indefinitely, in the zone between waking and whatever strange territory his consciousness inhabited instead of sleeping, doors opened that remained closed to others. Gifts arrived that had no sender. Machines appeared that had no origin except the mysterious transmission from wherever form waits before becoming matter. Were they real? Were they true? Did Tesla access genuine information through his sleepless vigil? Or did his exhausted brain simply generate convincing phantoms, hallucinations so vivid they seemed like revelation, symptoms that looked like gifts because genius sometimes emerges from the same cognitive states that signal breakdown? We cannot know. can only stand beside him in that pre-dawn laboratory, watching him watch something we cannot see, wondering whether to admire his vision or fear for his sanity, whether to celebrate his genius or mourn the price he paid for accessing territories that perhaps should remain forever inaccessible to consciousness that clings too long to waking, that refuses the nightly erasure that protects us from seeing too much, from perceiving things that may or may not exist outside the mind that generates them. The visions came in darkness, but not the darkness of sleep, the darkness of sleeplessness instead. The darkness that accumulates when eyes remain open too long, when consciousness refuses to surrender, when the mind pushed past its limits begins to populate the world with presences that live nowhere except in awareness too exhausted to distinguish between what is received and what is created, between insight and illusion, between the gifts that come from beyond and the phantoms that arise from within. Tesla saw machines that changed the world. This is undeniable. But what else did he see? What other visions appeared that could not be built, that made no sense, that revealed themselves as symptoms rather than insights? What phantoms walked his laboratory that he learned not to mention, not to share, not to acknowledge even to himself, because to acknowledge them would be to admit that not all his visions came from genius, that some arose from something darker, something more dangerous, something that had less to do with revelation and more to do with a mind slowly fracturing under pressures it was never designed to bear. The question echoes through the decades. The mystery remains. And somewhere in that space between wonder and warning, between celebration and caution, between the visions that illuminate and the phantoms that destroy, Tesla stands eternal, hands trembling slightly from exhaustion, eyes fixed on something only he can see, refusing to name whether it is gift or curse, insight or symptom, genius, or the first signs of the madness that will eventually claim him completely. The darkness holds its secrets. And Tesla, who lived in that darkness without sleeping, learned some of those secrets. But the price of learning them was written in the trajectory of his life, in the slow dissolution that followed the brilliant innovations, in the question that can never be fully answered. Did he see too much? Or did he only think he saw, his exhausted brain generating visions it mistook for truth, consciousness so displaced from ordinary reality that phantom and perception became indistinguishable, both equally real, both equally suspect, both arising from territories that perhaps were never meant to be inhabited by minds that refuse the protective darkness of sleep. Midnight to 4, the hours when most of humanity lay horizontal, surrendered, temporarily dissolved into that necessary darkness from which consciousness emerges each dawn like a swimmer surfacing from deep water. The hours when the city grew quiet, when the electrical grid that powered a million lives diminished to a whisper, when the electromagnetic noise of human activity faded to something approaching silence. These were Tesla's hours, the hours when he came most alive. The hours that belonged not to sleep, not to rest, not to the body's insistent demands for darkness and dissolution, but to lightning. In his laboratory on South Fifth Avenue, where the windows rattled in their frames and neighbors had learned to dread the approach of midnight, Tesla prepared for the work that could only happen in darkness. Not the darkness of closed eyes, not the darkness of consciousness released, but the darkness of the sleeping city around him, the absence of interference, the stillness that allowed him to call down forces that had terrified humanity since before we learned to walk upright and wonder about the fire that fell from storm clouds. It is said that he would begin his preparations as the clock struck 12. The city's electrical demand would be dropping precipitously as shops closed, as factories powered down, as the offices emptied and apartments darkened. The grid itself would be resting, in a sense less current flowing through the vast network of copper that spiderwebbed beneath streets and climbed the sides of buildings. Less resistance, less noise. Less interference between his apparatus and the invisible medium he believed conducted all energy, that he called the ether and that science would later claim did not exist, though Tesla insisted he could feel it, could sense its presence the way sailors sense approaching storms. He would move through the laboratory with purpose that bordered on ritual, each switch thrown in sequence, each connection verified. The copper spheres positioned exactly so not by measurement, though he could have calculated the optimal distance, but by intuition, by the strange sensitivity he had developed to electromagnetic fields, by knowledge that lived in his body rather than his conscious mind, that told him when the geometry was correct, when the configuration would allow what he intended, the controlled summoning of lightning itself. Beneath the silence of the sleeping city, beneath the hum that was always present in his laboratory even when nothing was actively running, Tesla would stand before his apparatus and become something other than human. Not quite priest, though there was something priestly in his bearing. Not quite sorcerer, though what he was about to do would have seemed like sorcery to anyone who did not understand the mathematics of resonance, of frequency, of how voltage could be stepped up through coiled transformations, until what entered the apparatus as the gentle current that lit a bulb emerged as something else entirely, as the raw power that split clouds, that ignited the air itself, that could kill or illuminate depending on how you channeled it. He would reach for the switch, the main switch. The one that would send power surging through the primary coil, that would create the oscillations, the alternations, the rapid reversals of polarity that would induce in the secondary coil voltages so extreme they existed nowhere in nature, except in the heart of storms, in the moment before the sky discharges its accumulated potential in bolts that have destroyed trees and towers and anyone unfortunate enough to stand in their path. And then, light, not the steady glow of incandescence, not the gentle illumination of gas flame, but something primal, something that belonged to the realm before humans learned to make fire, to the territory where nature kept its most fearsome powers, to the elemental forces that we had always fled from, hidden from, built shelters against, prayed would not notice our fragile presence. Purple light, blue-white. Colors that had no names because they existed only in these extreme energies, in the ionization of air molecules torn apart by voltages that should not exist in any space where flesh lived. The light would begin at the copper spheres, not touching them yet, not quite, but gathering in the space between like something alive, like something aware, like consciousness of a kind we cannot fathom looking for a path from one pole to the other. And then it would leap, lightning, contained, controlled. Dancing between the spheres in arcs that crackled and sang, that filled the laboratory with sound like tearing fabric, like the world splitting along seams invisible until voltage revealed them. The air itself would become visible in the space where the discharge traveled, would glow with that impossible purple blue, would smell of ozone, that sharp, clean scent that appears after thunderstorms. That is the smell of the atmosphere broken apart and reconstituted, of oxygen torn into its constituent atoms and reassembled into forms that don't exist in nature's ordinary chemistry. Some believe Tesla loved this, loved the power. Loved standing in a room filled with artificial lightning, with energies that could stop a heart at 20 paces, that could reduce flesh to char in an instant, that obeyed him, usually that performed at his command like trained beasts that had learned to recognize their master. There are photographs from later years showing him seated calmly, while bolts of lightning arc around him, strike the floor near his feet, illuminate the laboratory with that otherworldly glow. In the images, he appears serene, untouched, as though he had learned to exist in harmony with forces that would destroy anyone else who dared stand so close. But was it love, or was it compulsion? This is the question that hangs in the charged air, that hums beneath the crackling of the artificial thunder, that suggests itself in the reports of neighbors who heard the noise, who saw the strange glow emanating from his windows at hours when decent people slept, who spoke of feeling uneasy, of sensing that something unnatural was occurring, that the proper relationship between human and nature's powers was being violated in ways that might exact consequences no one could predict. Where memory fades and witnesses offer contradictory accounts, we are left with fragments. A neighbor's complaint to police about the noise that rattled her windows at 2 a.m, every morning, for weeks without respite. A journalist's description of visiting the laboratory during the day and seeing scorch marks on the walls, on the ceiling, burn patterns that traced where lightning had gone when it escaped Tesla's control, when it found its own path to ground, rather than following the route he had prepared for it. And Tesla's own accounts, written years later, describing those midnight hours with a mixture of technical precision and something approaching mystical awe. The way the apparatus would seem to come alive. The way the lightning, once summoned, would behave almost consciously, not following simple physical laws, but responding, he claimed, to his intention, to his will, to the relationship he had developed with these forces through thousands of hours of experimentation, of pushing voltages higher, of learning the frequencies at which the invisible ether would resonate, would amplify, would allow him to pull power from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Marked by the hours midnight, 1, 2, 3, 4, the experiments would continue. Tesla standing before his apparatus like conductor before orchestra, making adjustments, altering frequencies, watching the lightning dance and arc and sometimes escape, striking walls or ceiling or floor with cracks that could be heard blocks away, that brought complaints, that eventually brought building owners demanding he leave, threatening lawsuits, insisting that whatever he was doing was too dangerous to continue, that the risk to other tenants was unacceptable. That genius did not grant permission to endanger everyone within 100 feet of his relentless pursuit, but he could not stop. This is what the accounts suggest, that the midnight experiments were not optional, not leisure pursuit, not hobby that could be abandoned when convenient. They were necessity, compulsion. The hours when he felt most alive, most connected to something larger than himself, most certain that his sleeplessness served a purpose, that by remaining conscious through the hours when others slept he had access to something they did not, to power both literal and metaphorical, to forces that revealed themselves only to those willing to stand vigil in darkness and call down what should remain forever in the clouds. What happens when we claim dominion over forces we barely understand? When we pull lightning from the sky and make it dance in rooms where humans live, where flesh exists that could be destroyed in an instant if the control falters, if the apparatus fails, if the relationship between conductor and conducted breaks down. Tesla stood in that charged space nightly, stood at the boundary between mastery and servitude, between controlling the lightning and being controlled by the need to command it. Was he master of electricity? Or had electricity mastered him, turned him into its servant, its instrument, the human vessel through which these forces could enter the world in ways they never had before, in configurations that nature herself had never assembled? The question has no certain answer. Perhaps it is false binary. Perhaps what Tesla discovered in those midnight hours was that mastery and servitude are not opposites, but two names for the same relationship, two ways of describing the bond that forms when consciousness engages deeply enough with any force, any phenomenon, any territory of reality. The master becomes the servant of his mastery. The one who controls is controlled by the need to control. The boundary dissolves in the purple light, in the crackling discharge, in the ozone-scented air where Tesla stood alone at 3 in the morning summoning lightning while the city slept. Some nights the experiments would end in triumph. The lightning perfectly controlled, the voltages stepped up and stepped down exactly as theory predicted, the apparatus performing flawlessly, proving once again that human understanding could penetrate even the most fearsome of nature's mysteries, could make tools from what had been weapons, could transform terror into technology. Other nights the lightning would escape, would find paths Tesla had not predicted, would strike where it was not supposed to strike, would remind him that for all his understanding, for all his sleepless calculations, he was still flesh standing in the presence of forces that could erase flesh in milliseconds, that tolerated his presence but could revoke that tolerance without warning, without mercy, leaving nothing but carbon shadow where a genius had stood. And some nights the accounts are unclear on how often, but they suggest it was not rare Tesla would stand in the midst of the artificial storm and feel something else entirely. Not control, not fear, but communion, connection to something vast. As though the lightning was not merely physical phenomenon, but carrier wave for something else, some information or presence that existed in the electromagnetic spectrum at frequencies most humans never perceive, that he could sense only because his sleepless vigil had opened channels in consciousness that sleep normally keeps closed, that rest normally protects us from opening. The dawn would come. Would arrive as it always did, indifferent to whether anyone had slept, whether any mind had rested, whether any consciousness had taken the darkness as invitation to dissolve and renew. The first light would touch the laboratory windows. The purple glow of Tesla's experiments would fade, become wan and sickly in the growing daylight, lose its otherworldly power and reveal itself as what it was. Electricity, high voltage but ultimately comprehensible, governed by laws that could be written and taught, stripped of the mystical aura that darkness had granted it. Tesla would power down the apparatus, would move through the shutdown sequence with the same ritual precision as the startup, would stand for a moment in the growing light, surrounded by his copper coils and glass tubes, and the instruments whose needles had pegged at the upper limits of their scales, bearing witness to voltages that existed nowhere else except in his laboratory during those midnight hours. He would be exhausted. How could he not be? Hours of standing, of focus, of maintaining the precise mental state required to work with forces that allowed no distraction, no lapse, no moment of reduced attention. His hands would tremble slightly from the electromagnetic fields they had been exposed to, from the accumulated exhaustion of another sleepless night, from the particular strain of commanding lightning while flesh insists on its vulnerability, while biology reminds that one mistake, one miscalculation, one moment of failed attention could end everything. But he would not sleep, would not lie down, would not surrender to the darkness that his body begged for. Instead, he would turn to other work. To the daylight experiments, to the correspondence, to the 1,000 other demands that filled his waking hours, which were all his hours, which were every hour, which consumed time without respite, without rest, without the periodic dissolution that allows consciousness to continue sustainably across decades. The hours that belonged to lightning had passed. The city was waking. And Tesla, who had stood vigil while it slept, who had called down forces that should remain in clouds, who had spent another night refusing the ancient human covenant with darkness, remained as he always was. Vertical, alert, exhausted beyond measure, unable to stop, unable to rest, unable to acknowledge that the master of lightning was himself mastered by something he could not name, could not control, could not escape no matter how high he stepped the voltage, no matter how perfectly his apparatus performed, no matter how completely the lightning obeyed his commands. The question echoes through the silence that follows thunder. Who truly held the power in that laboratory? The man who stood before the apparatus? Or the lightning that answered his call? The consciousness that remained forever awake? Or the sleeplessness that allowed no rest, no peace, no release from the relentless need to summon and control and command forces that perhaps were never meant to be domesticated, never meant to answer to human will, never meant to dance at the bidding of flesh that should have been sleeping, that should have been horizontal, that should have released its grip on waking and let the darkness be kind. The hours belonged to lightning. But perhaps the lightning also belonged to those hours. And Tesla, standing between them, commanded neither, was commanded instead by compulsion he could not name, by visions he could not escape, by the need to remain conscious through the time when consciousness should cease, to work when others rested, to call down light from darkness even as darkness accumulated in his mind, in his body, in the slow erosion of the self that stands too long at the boundary between control and chaos, between mastery and servitude, between the power that illuminates and the power that eventually, inevitably, mercilessly destroys. There are debts that accumulate in silence, accounts kept in tissues and neurons, in the chemistry of blood, in the electrical firing patterns of a nervous system stretched too thin for too long. Invoices written in a language the conscious mind cannot read, presented only after years, decades of non-payment, demanding settlement in trembling hands, in racing heartbeat, in the sudden rebellion of systems that had performed flawlessly until the moment they could perform no longer. Tesla believed he had transcended the body's needs, believed that will alone could override biology's ancient demands, believed that 2 hours of what he called rest, though it was not sleep, never sleep, just a brief dimming rather than true darkness, were sufficient because he had decided they were sufficient, as though the flesh that carried his consciousness operated by negotiation rather than law. As though millions of years of evolution could be reasoned with, bargained with, convinced to accept different terms than those written into every cell, every synapse, every rhythm that governed the machinery of being alive. But the body keeps its own accounts, follows its own mathematics, and eventually always the bill comes due. It is said that the first signs appeared in his early 40s, though Tesla himself would not have called them signs, would have dismissed them as minor inconveniences, temporary conditions that required no particular attention, certainly no change to the practices that had made him what he was. The man who would not sleep, the consciousness that refused to cease, the mind that had learned to operate continuously through sheer force of will. His hands began to shake, not constantly at first, not in ways that others would notice immediately. But when he tried to write, when he attempted the fine motor control required to sketch circuit diagrams or sign documents, his fingers would tremble. The pen would waver. The lines he drew would zigzag slightly, would betray the instability beneath the surface, the small earthquake occurring in the nervous system of a man who insisted he had no need for rest. Some believe he tried to hide this, would write only when alone, would ask assistants to transcribe for him, claiming he preferred to dictate, that speaking his thoughts aloud helped him think more clearly. But those who knew him suspected otherwise. Suspected that the man who had controlled lightning could no longer control his own hands, that the precision required for his work was being stolen by exhaustion, so deep it had soaked into bone, into nerve, into the fundamental architecture of the body that had carried him through thousands of sleepless nights, and was now, finally, sending messages that could no longer be ignored. Where memory fades into the uncertainties of medical records and second-hand accounts, we glimpse other symptoms. Strange ones. Symptoms that seemed to have no physical origin, that doctors examined and found mysterious, that suggested the breakdown was not only physical but psychological, or perhaps, and this is closer to the truth, that the distinction between physical and psychological dissolves when exhaustion runs deep enough. When the body and mind both begin to malfunction in ways that mirror each other, that cannot be separated because they arise from the same source. A nervous system never allowed to rest, a consciousness never permitted to dissolve, a self held together by will alone long past the point where will should be sufficient. He could not touch anything round. This compulsion appeared gradually, then became absolute. Pearls especially disturbed him. He would recoil from women wearing them, would refuse to shake hands with anyone whose cufflinks bore that curved perfection. Round objects carried contamination he could sense but not explain, danger he could feel but not articulate. His conscious mind knew this made no sense. His rational intelligence, still brilliant, still capable of profound insight, recognized the irrationality. But knowledge did not help. The compulsion operated at a level below reason, below will, in territories where exhaustion had rewritten the rules of what consciousness would tolerate, what the self could bear to encounter. He would count his steps obsessively. Had to, not wanted to had to. If he walked to his laboratory, the number of steps must be divisible by 3. If not, he would return to the starting point and begin again, and again, until the mathematics satisfied whatever internal requirement had established itself in his mind like an uninvited guest, like a program running beneath awareness, like the body taking revenge through the imposition of rituals that had no purpose except to demonstrate that will was not omnipotent, that consciousness could be hijacked by processes it did not control, that the sleepless mind becomes host to strange algorithms that make their own demands. Beneath the silence of his daily routines, beneath the appearance of functionality, Tesla was coming apart. Not dramatically, not in ways that others immediately recognized as crisis, but gradually, imperceptibly, like a building settling on a foundation that has been slowly eroding, that one day without warning will fail completely. His weight dropped. He had never been heavy, but now he became skeletal. Photographs from his 50s show a man who appears ancient, haunted, as though decades had been added to his face in the space of years. His eyes, which had once held that peculiar intensity of genius, grew wild not with insight now, but with something closer to fear, to the recognition that something had gone wrong, that the experiment he had been running using his own body and mind as laboratory was producing results he had not predicted and could not control. Some believe he knew. That in his private moments, when the compulsions had been satisfied and the trembling had temporarily subsided, when he sat alone in his hotel room, surrounded by papers covered in calculations that grew increasingly abstract, increasingly disconnected from anything that could be built, he knew that his methods had become his undoing. That the sleeplessness that had once seemed like advantage had transformed into curse. That the body he had tried to transcend was asserting itself with increasing violence, demanding payment for decades of denied rest, of refused darkness, of consciousness maintained past all reasonable limits. But knowing did not change his behavior. Could not. Because by then, the practices that were destroying him had become indistinguishable from his identity. To surrender them would be to surrender himself. To acknowledge that sleep was necessary would be to admit that the architecture of his entire adult life had been error, that the man he had made himself into was not transcendent, but damaged, not evolved beyond human limitation, but broken by the attempt to evolve. Marked by the year 1905, the accumulation reached critical mass. Tesla suffered what the medical records call a nervous breakdown, though that term captures nothing of what actually occurred, of the complete systemic failure of a consciousness that had been forced to operate too long without rest, of a mind that finally, after decades of abuse, simply stopped functioning in any coherent way. For months, he could not work, could not focus, could not hold a thought long enough to complete it. The visions that had once arrived as gifts now came as torments, machines appearing and disappearing before he could examine them, equations dissolving as soon as they formed, the sense that his own mind had become unreliable, that perception itself could no longer be trusted. His doctors recommended rest. Of course they did. What else could they recommend? The diagnosis was obvious even to medical science that understood nothing of sleep deprivation's long-term effects, that lacked the tools to measure what Tesla had done to his nervous system, that could only observe the wreckage and suggest the one treatment that might help. Sleep. Real sleep. 8 hours, 10 hours, as much as the body demanded. The darkness he had refused for decades, offered now as medicine, as the only possible path back to functionality. But he could not. Even then, even in the midst of breakdown so complete he could barely leave his hotel room, he could not surrender to sleep. The insomnia that had begun as choice had become compulsion, had become physiological reality, had rewired his nervous system so thoroughly that even when he wanted to rest, and by then he desperately wanted to sleep, would not come. Or would come only briefly, in fragments, in fits and starts that provided no restoration, that left him more exhausted upon waking than he had been before lying down. The body that would not forgive had delivered its verdict. And the sentence was this: you will continue. You will not sleep, not because you choose wakefulness, but because you have damaged the systems that allow sleep. You have broken the machinery of rest so thoroughly that it can no longer function. You wanted to transcend the body's needs. Congratulations, you have succeeded. But transcendence, it turns out, looks exactly like destruction. And now you will live for decades more in the wreckage of your victory. Some believe there is cruelty in this, that the universe or nature or whatever force governs the relationship between consciousness and the flesh it inhabits was punishing Tesla for his hubris, for his attempt to override biological law, for his insistence that will could triumph over need. But this interpretation misunderstands. There is no cruelty, only cause and effect, only the working out of consequences that were always inevitable, that followed from his choices the way shadows follow objects in light, the way echoes follow sounds in canyons, mechanical, impersonal, utterly indifferent to whether the person experiencing them is genius or ordinary, whether their motives were noble or foolish, whether they deserve mercy or justice. The body does not punish. The body simply responds, follows its own logic, obeys its own laws. And when those laws are violated consistently enough, for long enough, it responds the only way it can, by failing, by breaking down, by sending increasingly desperate signals that something is wrong, that damage is accumulating, that practices sustainable for years are not sustainable forever, that bills deferred are not bills forgiven, that every hour of denied rest is an hour that will eventually need to be accounted for. Where does genius come from, and what does it cost? These questions have haunted humanity for as long as we have recognized that some minds operate differently, see more clearly, penetrate more deeply into reality's hidden structures. We celebrate the insights, build monuments to the innovations, tell stories about the breakthroughs that changed how we understand the world, how we live in it. But we rarely count the cost, rarely ask what price was paid for the vision that illuminates. Rarely examine the wreckage left in genius's wake, not just the external wreckage of relationships and stability and ordinary human happiness, but the internal wreckage, the damage done to the body and mind that housed the brilliance, the slow erosion of the self that burned too bright and too long without the restorative darkness that makes sustained burning possible. Tesla paid with his body. Paid with trembling hands and wild eyes and compulsions that made no sense but could not be resisted. Paid with the nervous breakdown and the years of diminished capacity that followed it. Paid with the slow recognition, growing stronger as decades accumulated, that he had won his battle against sleep and lost his war against being human, that consciousness cannot be sustained indefinitely without dissolution, that the mind requires periodic erasure, or it begins to erase itself in ways that cannot be controlled, that follow no plan, that destroy indiscriminately what took decades to build. And yet he could not stop, even knowing the cost, even feeling it in every tremor, every compulsion, every moment when his mind would not cooperate with his intentions, when thoughts would scatter like startled birds before he could organize them into anything useful. He could not stop because stopping would require acknowledging that his entire approach had been error, that the man who would not sleep had built himself on sand, that the foundation was crumbling and could not be repaired, only abandoned, and abandonment was impossible because the man and the practices had become one thing, inseparable, so that to give up sleeplessness would be to give up Tesla himself. So he continued through the breakdown and beyond it. Continued into his 60s, his 70s, his 80s, the trembling growing worse, the compulsions more elaborate, the gap between his internal experience and external reality widening, until even he could not always tell which visions were insights and which were symptoms, which ideas could be built, and which existed only in territories accessible to consciousness too exhausted to distinguish between perception and generation, between discovery and delusion. The body kept its accounts, presented its bills, extracted its payment in installments that grew larger as time progressed, as the debt accumulated beyond any possibility of settlement, as Tesla moved through his final decades carrying the weight of denied rest, of refused darkness, of consciousness maintained too long at too high a cost. Did he regret it? We cannot know. The records do not say. Perhaps he could not have answered even if asked, because regret requires imagining an alternate path, and Tesla's imagination was so thoroughly captured by what he had become that other possibilities had ceased to exist, had been erased by the same practices that had given him his visions, his insights, his revolutionary understanding of how to harness forces that had terrified humanity since the first lightning split the first sky. Perhaps regret is the wrong question. Perhaps what matters is simpler and more profound, that the body does not forgive, not because it is cruel, but because it is honest, because it operates according to laws that consciousness can theorize about but cannot override. Because rest is not optional, and darkness is not the enemy, and sleep is not weakness but the very thing that makes wakefulness sustainable, that allows consciousness to continue across decades without destroying itself, without burning out like a star that shines too bright and collapses into the density from which no light escapes. Tesla stood at his workbench, trembling, counting, avoiding round objects, fighting compulsions. Working still, always working, because work was all that remained, all that kept the self assembled in the face of forces that wanted to scatter it, that would scatter it eventually, that were already scattering it but slowly, slowly enough that the process could be denied, could be called something else, could be ignored until the day when ignoring was no longer possible and the body delivered its final bill, its ultimate statement. You owe everything. And now I collect. 3 a.m, the hour when even insomniacs usually find sleep, when the city reaches its deepest silence, when the last lights in windows finally go dark and humanity surrenders, collectively, to the necessary dissolution that prepares consciousness for dawn's return. The hour when the world becomes most still, most quiet, most empty of human presence. This was Tesla's hour. Not by choice, perhaps, though by then the distinction between choosing and being chosen had long since dissolved. This was the hour when his solitude became most complete. When the awareness that he stood alone, not just physically alone in his laboratory, but temporally alone, existentially alone, separated from all other human consciousness by the simple fact that they slept, and he did not would settle over him like weight that had no physical mass, but pressed down nonetheless, heavier than copper, heavier than the coils that filled his workspace, heavier than anything that could be measured on scales designed for ordinary matter. It is said that Tesla would sometimes pause his work at this hour, would set down whatever instrument he held, would step away from whatever apparatus hummed and crackled in the charged air, would move to the window and look out at the city that had abandoned him to wakefulness. The streets empty, the windows dark. Not a single light visible except his own, reflected in the glass before him, making him into ghost, into phantom, into the only consciousness still operating in a world that had collectively agreed to stop, to rest, to release its grip on awareness and drift into the shared darkness that bound communities together in ways the waking world could never match. What companions exist for those who refuse to join humanity in its nightly dissolution? What conversations occur in the mind that will not rest? What comfort can be found when the temporal rhythm that synchronizes human lives, the shared descent into darkness, the collective return to light, has been rejected, or has rejected you, leaving you stranded in the hours that belong to no one, that exist outside the cycle that gives meaning to yesterday and today and tomorrow? Beneath the silence of his laboratory, beneath the hum of machinery that never stopped, Tesla would feel it, the isolation that went deeper than physical solitude, that penetrated into territories where loneliness becomes ontological rather than merely social. He was not just alone in his laboratory. He was alone in time itself, occupying hours that the rest of humanity had vacated, existing in a present that no one else inhabited, watching the clock hands move through sequences that marked time for him but meant nothing to those who slept, who would not remember 3 a.m., who would wake at dawn with no knowledge of the hours he had witnessed, the vigil he had kept, the loneliness he had endured while they rested in the blessed darkness he had denied himself. Some believe he tried, at first, to maintain connections with the waking world. That in his younger years, before the sleeplessness had carved him into something too strange for ordinary human company, he had friends, colleagues, social gatherings where his brilliance made him celebrated rather than isolated. But the sleeplessness changed everything. Changed him. Not all at once, but gradually, as the gap between his rhythms and everyone else's widened into a chasm that could not be bridged. How do you maintain friendships when you exist in different time? When their evenings are your mornings, when their mornings are your 1,000th consecutive hour of wakefulness, when the experiences that bind people together, the shared meals, the conversations that happen in particular states of energy and alertness, the simple act of going to bed knowing that everyone else is also going to bed, are impossible because you have placed yourself outside the cycle, or the cycle has expelled you, or both, simultaneously, in ways that cannot be disentangled. The invitations stopped coming. Not abruptly, not with confrontation or explanation, but through the natural attrition that occurs when someone proves too difficult to include, too uncomfortable to be around, too obviously displaced from ordinary human rhythms to fit into social structures designed for people who sleep, who rest, who understand instinctively the unspoken rules about when to be alert and when to wind down, when to be present and when to withdraw into the private darkness where the self temporarily dissolves. Tesla stopped going, stopped accepting what few invitations still arrived. Not from bitterness, or not only from bitterness, but from recognition that he no longer fit, that his presence disturbed the natural flow of conversation, that his eyes carried something that made others uncomfortable, some quality of exhaustion or intensity, or both, that marked him as other. As someone who had crossed boundaries and could not return, who occupied territories that those who rested could sense but could not access, could not understand, could not follow him into even if they wanted to. Where memory fades into the sparse documentation of his personal life, we find traces of what filled the void. Not human companions, but others, other presences, other forms of connection that could accommodate his temporal displacement, his inability to synchronize with the shared rhythms that bind people into communities, into relationships, into the simple comfort of not being alone. He spoke to his machines, not metaphorically. Not in the way that people sometimes address objects as a figure of speech, but literally, conversationally, as though the apparatus that filled his laboratory were capable of response, of understanding, of providing the companionship that human beings could no longer offer. He would explain his thoughts to the copper coils, would describe his visions to the glass tubes, would discuss his calculations with the instruments that measured voltages no human body could survive. Was this madness, or was it adaptation? The question has no simple answer. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps when human connection becomes impossible, consciousness finds other forms of relationship, other ways of not being utterly alone, other presences even if those presences exist only in the mind that addresses them, only in the desperate need for connection that will grasp at anything, will project consciousness onto anything, will make companions from copper and glass because flesh and blood have proved too tied to rhythms that cannot accommodate sleeplessness. And there were the pigeons. Always the pigeons. It is said that Tesla began feeding them sometime in his 40s, though the exact year is uncertain, lost to the gaps in biographical record. But by his 50s, the practice had become ritual every evening. After the sun had set and before the midnight experiments began, he would walk to Madison Square Park, to the plaza in front of the library, to the places where pigeons congregated even after dark, drawn by the presence of someone who arrived reliably, who carried seed, who would scatter it across the pavement and stand quietly while they descended to feed. They did not judge. This was perhaps their first gift. They did not look at his trembling hands and wonder what was wrong. They did not notice the wild quality in his eyes, the appearance of exhaustion that had carved itself into his face, the strangeness that marked him as displaced from ordinary human rhythms. They simply came when he called, ate what he offered, allowed him to exist in their presence without demanding that he explain himself, that he justify his practices, that he be anything other than what he was. A source of food, a reliable presence in the evening darkness, a consciousness that shared their hours because pigeons, too, are awake when many humans sleep, are part of the city's nocturnal ecology, occupy the same temporal territory that Tesla inhabited through his refusal of rest. Beneath the silence of these encounters, beneath the simple transaction of food offered and accepted, something deeper developed. Connection, relationship, the kind that arises when consciousness is so starved for companionship that even the presence of birds becomes meaningful, becomes necessary, becomes the only form of contact that doesn't require synchronization with rhythms that have become impossible to follow. He had favorites. Of course he did. One in particular, a female with gray-tipped wings, white body, eyes that he claimed held intelligence, recognition, perhaps even affection. He spoke of her in letters written late in his life, described her in terms that shocked those who read them, claimed that he loved her as a man loves a woman, that she visited his window, that she brought him messages, that she understood him in ways that humans could not, would not, had long since given up trying to. Was this delusion? Or was it the only form of love still available to someone who had become too strange for human intimacy, too displaced from shared time to maintain relationships that required synchronization, coordination, the ability to be present when presence was expected rather than when exhaustion briefly permitted it? Some believe Tesla's attachment to the pigeons was symptom of his deterioration, evidence that sleeplessness had finally fractured his ability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate objects of affection, between human and animal, between connection that made sense and connection born purely from desperation. But those who witnessed him with the birds spoke of gentleness that seemed to come from some part of him that the laboratory work never accessed, that the electrical experiments never touched, that remained somehow uncorrupted by the practices that had destroyed so much else. He would speak to them in soft voices, would single out individuals, would recognize them, claim to recognize them from their markings, their behavior, the way they responded to his presence. Would spend an hour sometimes, standing in the park as the city moved around him, oblivious to the traffic, to the pedestrians who gave him wide berth, to everything except the birds that circled and landed and fed and seemed, in their simple acceptance of his presence, to offer what nothing else could. Companionship without judgment, relationship without demands, connection that required nothing but the consistent provision of seed and the willingness to stand still, to be present, to share the evening hours when the boundary between day and night grows uncertain, and those who exist in that uncertainty can find each other. Marked by the years, the relationship deepened. Tesla's life contracted around it. The laboratory work continued, it never stopped. could never stop, but the pigeons became increasingly central, increasingly necessary, increasingly the only thing that seemed to reach whatever remained human in him, whatever the sleeplessness and the isolation had not yet consumed. When the white pigeon died, the one he claimed to love, the one who visited his window, who he insisted understood him, something broke in Tesla that had not been broken before. He described receiving a message from her at the moment of her death, claimed that light appeared in his room, that he knew she was gone before any physical evidence could confirm it, that the loss hollowed him in ways that the death of human companions never had. Perhaps this seems pathetic, tragic. The great inventor reduced to mourning a bird, to investing such profound emotion in a creature that could not possibly have returned it, that probably did not recognize him as anything more than a reliable source of food, that lived in a different reality entirely, inaccessible to human consciousness, no matter how long that consciousness remained awake, no matter how displaced it became from ordinary human rhythms. But perhaps it was also inevitable. Perhaps when you remove yourself, or are removed from the shared temporal existence that binds people together, when you occupy hours that no one else witnesses, when your loneliness becomes so complete that even the possibility of human connection seems like something from a past life that you can barely remember, perhaps then the pigeons make perfect sense. Perhaps they are not symptom, but solution, not delusion, but the only form of relationship that can survive when consciousness has been pushed so far outside normal parameters that normal relationships become impossible. The loneliness of the illuminated mind. This phrase suggests something paradoxical, that seeing more, understanding more, perceiving things hidden from others, should result in isolation rather than connection. But Tesla's life proved the phrase true in ways that go beyond metaphor. His illumination, literal and figurative, both separated him from humanity as effectively as physical distance. The visions that appeared in his sleepless vigils, the understanding of electrical forces that others could not grasp, the insights that arrived at 3 a.m. when no one else was awake to share them. All of it pushed him further into solitude. All of it made connection harder. All of it demonstrated that genius, when it requires such violation of human rhythms, when it demands such displacement from shared time, extracts as its price the very thing that makes human life bearable. The simple knowledge that you are not alone, that others exist in the same moment you do, that consciousness is shared rather than solitary, that the hours you witness are also witnessed by others who can confirm that they happened, that they mattered, that you were not the only one awake in a sleeping world. Tesla was the only one awake. This was his achievement and his curse. This was what sleeplessness gave him and what it took away. The ability to work through the hours when others rested. And the loneliness of being the only consciousness present in those hours, the only witness to the darkness that the rest of humanity visited through sleep, but that he visited while standing, while alert, while isolated in wakefulness that could not be shared because it existed outside the cycle that made sharing possible. Did he choose this, or did it choose him? The question echoes through the empty laboratory, through the pre-dawn hours when even the machines seemed to grow quiet, through the moments when he would stand at the window and see nothing but darkness, and know that he was alone in ways that went beyond physical solitude, that penetrated into the structure of time itself, that made him a ghost in his own life, present but somehow also absent, awake but dreaming the strangest dream of all. The dream of permanent wakefulness, of consciousness that cannot cease, of a mind so illuminated it can no longer see the simple darkness where others rest together, where connection lives, where loneliness dissolves each night in the shared surrender to sleep. The pigeons waited in the park. They would wait tomorrow too, and the day after. And every day until Tesla himself stopped coming, stopped walking, stopped occupying even the marginal territory where human and bird could meet in the evening darkness, and pretend, for a few moments, that consciousness was not quite so alone as it felt at 3 a.m. when the laboratory hummed and the city slept, and the only companions available were copper coils and glass tubes and birds that could not understand, but at least did not judge, did not require, did not demand anything except the seed he scattered and the quiet presence of someone who existed, like them, in hours that belonged to no one, that fell outside the human clock, that marked time in a territory where loneliness was not tragedy but simple fact, not punishment, but the natural consequence of refusing to sleep, of remaining conscious when consciousness should cease, of illuminating the mind so thoroughly that it could no longer bear the darkness where all human connection lives. Waiting patiently for those willing to close their eyes and join each other in the only place where loneliness truly ends. In the shared darkness of sleep that Tesla would not accept, could not accept, and paid for that refusal with a solitude so complete that even genius could not fill it, could not bridge it, could only acknowledge it in the small hours of the morning when the truth became unavoidable that he was alone, had been alone for decades, would die alone, because the illuminated mind casts shadows too deep for others to cross, too cold for warmth to penetrate, too complete for anything to survive except the consciousness that created them, and the birds that, mercifully, required nothing but seed and silence, and the evening hours when the day had ended, but night had not yet begun, and anything that existed in between could find, briefly, companionship in the gathering dark. What images never formed because he would not close his eyes? What stories went untold because consciousness remained forever on, forever alert, forever refusing the theater where the self performs its nightly ritual of dissolution and reconstitution? What wisdom was lost in the absence of that strange narrative logic that appears only when waking thought releases its grip and something older, something that speaks in symbols rather than calculations, rises from the depths to sort and sift and make sense of what the day has brought? Dreams are where consciousness processes, where the chaos of accumulated experience gets organized into something resembling order, where memory decides what to keep and what to discard, where emotions find their proper place in the vast architecture of the self. Dreams are how we integrate, how we take the 1,000 impressions that bombard us daily and weave them into the continuous story we tell ourselves about who we are, what we've experienced, what it means to be the particular consciousness we inhabit. But Tesla denied himself this nightly sorting, refused the dissolution that allows reorganization, kept consciousness vertical, alert, accumulating experience without the processing that transforms raw sensation into integrated memory, that files away what can be filed and releases what must be released. Everything piled up. It is said that memory is not storage but reconstruction. That each time we remember something, we are not retrieving a fixed record but rebuilding it from fragments. And in that rebuilding, dreams play their essential role, strengthening some connections, weakening others, deciding which details matter and which can fade, maintaining the essential architecture while allowing the unnecessary to crumble away like ancient structures returning slowly to dust. But without dreams, without that nightly maintenance, what happens? The fragments accumulate. The connections multiply beyond usefulness. Nothing fades because nothing is permitted to fade. Every sight, every thought, every electrical vision, every mathematical insight, every conversation, every sensation from thousands of sleepless nights, all of it pressing together in a mind that never paused to organize, never rested long enough to file anything away, never gave the waking world a chance to settle into the neat categories of memory that make consciousness sustainable across decades. Some believe this was Tesla's secret advantage, that the raw, unprocessed intensity of a consciousness that never stopped, never dissolved, never gave experience a chance to become mere memory. This was what allowed his visions, his insights, his ability to see connections others missed. That by refusing dreams, he maintained access to everything simultaneously, could hold it all in awareness at once, could trace relationships across vast territories of experience because nothing had been neatly organized away. Nothing had been reduced to the simplified narratives that dreams create, that allow us to move through our lives without being overwhelmed by the totality of what we have experienced. Perhaps there is truth in this. Perhaps the early innovations, the revolutionary insights, the devices that appeared complete in his vision, perhaps these emerged precisely because his mind had not been sorted, had not been organized, had remained in a state of creative chaos where unusual connections could form, where thoughts separated by years or context could collide in ways that suggested new possibilities, new configurations, new understanding. But if this was advantage, it was advantage that carried a hidden cost. A cost that would only reveal itself after decades, after the accumulated experience had grown so massive that even Tesla's formidable consciousness could no longer hold it all, could no longer navigate the labyrinth of memory that had no organizing principle, no hierarchy of importance, no system for determining what mattered and what could be released. Beneath the silence of his sleepless nights, beneath the visions and the experiments and the relentless pursuit of understanding, something was breaking. Not all at once, not in ways immediately visible, but gradually, imperceptibly, like a vessel filling past its capacity, like storage space occupied beyond its limits, like a mind that had taken in so much without ever releasing anything that it was beginning to collapse under its own accumulated weight. Where does consciousness store what it cannot process? Where does experience go when dreams do not sort it, do not integrate it, do not perform the essential alchemy of transforming immediate sensation into organized memory? Modern neuroscience speaks of this with increasing clarity. Dreams consolidate memory. Dreams process emotion. Dreams allow the brain to prune unnecessary connections, to strengthen essential pathways, to maintain the delicate balance between retaining what matters and discarding what does not. Sleep is not rest alone, it is active reorganization, essential maintenance, the nightly cleaning and sorting that keeps consciousness functional across a lifetime. But Tesla had no such maintenance. No nightly cleaning, no sorting, just accumulation, endless accumulation. Experience piling upon experience, memory layering over memory, thought entangling with thought, until the architecture of his consciousness began to resemble not an organized system, but a hoard everything kept, nothing discarded, the essential and the trivial given equal weight because no process existed to distinguish between them. Some believe his later mental difficulties stemmed from this, from decades of unprocessed experience, from consciousness that had no release valve, no opportunity for the natural attrition that allows the self to remain coherent, focused, capable of distinguishing between past and present, between what matters and what is merely noise. The obsessive compulsions that appeared, the inability to tolerate round objects, the counting rituals, the paranoia that gradually infiltrated his thinking. The grand theories that grew more elaborate and less connected to anything that could be tested, that could be built, that existed anywhere except in territories accessible only to a mind that had lost its ability to distinguish between insight and delusion, between vision and hallucination, between what was real and what was generated by consciousness, so overfull it had begun to create its own reality simply to accommodate everything it refused to release. Perhaps dreams would have prevented this. Perhaps if Tesla had allowed his consciousness to dissolve nightly, to undergo the temporary death that permits resurrection, the accumulated chaos could have been sorted, organized, integrated into something sustainable rather than something that would eventually consume him from within. But perhaps not. Perhaps by the time he might have recognized the cost, the damage was already too profound to repair. Perhaps consciousness, once it has operated for decades without the processing that dreams provide, cannot return to dreaming. Perhaps the patterns become too fixed, the accumulation too massive, the self too rigidly constructed around the practice of never letting go, never releasing, never allowing anything to fade. Marked by the passing years, by the slow transformation from brilliant innovator to eccentric recluse, from revolutionary thinker to man whose ideas grew increasingly strange, increasingly disconnected from reality's constraints, Tesla demonstrated what happens when consciousness refuses the nightly dissolution that allows renewal. He became living proof that the mind requires periodic emptying, that memory needs dreams to remain functional, that consciousness sustained without processing eventually turns on itself, becomes its own enemy, generates problems faster than it can solve them until problem and solution become indistinguishable and everything past, present, vision, memory, insight. Delusion exists simultaneously in a chaos that calls itself clarity, but is actually breakdown, disintegration. The slow unraveling of a self that held together through will alone long past the point where will should be sufficient. Did he know? This is the question that haunts the later biographical accounts, that appears in letters written in his final decades, that suggests itself in moments of lucidity that would occasionally break through the confusion, offering glimpses of self-awareness, of recognition that something had gone profoundly wrong. that the magnificent machine of his consciousness was malfunctioning in ways he could observe but could not repair. He wrote once, in a letter discovered after his death, about dreams he had not dreamed. About wondering what his sleeping mind might have shown him, what insights might have arrived through the language of symbols rather than through the exhausted visions of sleeplessness. About the possibility articulated only tentatively, as though the thought itself was dangerous that by refusing dreams, he had denied himself access to wisdom deeper than calculation, to knowledge that arrives only when consciousness surrenders its control and allows something older, something that speaks in images rather than equations, to offer its perspective. But by then it was too late. The patterns were too deeply etched. The consciousness that had operated for decades without dreams could not remember how to dream, could not release control long enough for the older wisdom to emerge, could not surrender to the dissolution that might have saved him because surrender itself had become impossible, had been trained out of him through thousands of nights of remaining vertical, alert, conscious when consciousness should have ceased. Some believe there is tragedy in this. That Tesla's refusal of dreams was the refusal that cost him everything, not immediately, not visibly, but eventually, inevitably, as the accumulated weight of unprocessed experience crushed the very consciousness that refused to process it. That the dreams he would not have became the insights he could not access, the release he could not achieve, the renewal that might have sustained him across decades, but instead remained forever out of reach, forbidden not by external force, but by the practices he had made central to his identity, to his sense of who he was, and what made him different from others who wasted, as he saw it, 8 hours nightly in unconscious oblivion. But perhaps tragedy is the wrong frame. Perhaps what Tesla demonstrated was simpler and more profound, that consciousness has requirements, that the self needs periodic dissolution or it becomes rigid, brittle, unable to adapt to new information because all information is retained with equal weight, given equal importance, stored without hierarchy or organization until storage itself becomes burden, becomes prison, becomes the thing that destroys rather than preserves. Dreams are release. This is what the sleepless life revealed. Dreams are how consciousness lets go, how memory remains fluid rather than fixed, how the self maintains coherence without calcification, how we process not just information but emotion, not just experience but meaning, not just what happened but what it signified, how it changed us, what it added to or subtracted from the continuous story we tell ourselves about the journey from birth to death. Tesla told himself a story, that he had transcended the need for dreams. That consciousness could operate continuously without the nightly sorting. That will and purpose were sufficient to maintain the self across decades of wakefulness. But the story was wrong. And the price of believing it was written in the trajectory of his later years, the increasing confusion, the difficulty distinguishing past from present, the sense that time itself had become unmoored, that memory was no longer a reliable guide to what had actually occurred, but had become instead a chaos where everything existed simultaneously, where decades collapsed into each other, and nothing could be sequenced properly, because sequencing requires the kind of organization that only dreams provide. Where does wisdom live? In the waking mind, we assume. In conscious thought, deliberate calculation, the focused attention that solves problems through direct engagement. But perhaps wisdom lives also perhaps primarily in dreams. In the nightly dissolution that allows consciousness to see differently, to reorganize what seemed fixed, to discover connections that direct attention misses, because direct attention can only see what it looks for, while dreams see what they find, following logic that seems nonsensical until morning reveals that something important has shifted. Something has been understood that could not be understood while consciousness remained in control. Tesla never accessed this wisdom, could not access it, had chosen or been chosen by a path that made it impossible. And in that impossibility lived perhaps his greatest loss, not the inventions he failed to create, not the insights he missed, but the simple human experience of waking from dreams refreshed, renewed, reorganized in ways that consciousness cannot accomplish alone, that require the surrender he would not make, the dissolution he could not accept, the temporary death that permits the kind of resurrection he needed but never received. The dreams he would not have remained forever potential, forever waiting. forever offering renewal that could not be accepted because acceptance required closing his eyes, releasing control, trusting the darkness to do its essential work of sorting and sifting, and organizing the chaos that consciousness generates simply by remaining too long awake, too long alert, too long insisting that it can do alone what requires the partnership between waking and sleeping, between consciousness that accumulates and dreams that process, between the self that stands and the self that dissolves and reforms nightly, emerging each morning slightly different, slightly reorganized, slightly better able to face the day because the night has performed its invisible labor, has sorted what needed sorting, has released what needed releasing, has made space for what will come by letting go of what has passed. Tesla had no such space, had filled every chamber of consciousness and refused to empty any, had accumulated for decades without release. And the cost was a mind that worked brilliantly until it didn't, that produced insights until it produced delusions, that remained functional until functionality itself became impossible because the vessel was too full, the connections too tangled, the self too heavily weighted with unprocessed experience to continue carrying it forward. Perhaps ignorance would have been easier. Perhaps understanding less would have allowed him to rest more. Perhaps the dreams he refused contained not just processing, but mercy, the mercy of forgetting, of letting go, of allowing some things to fade so that others could remain vivid, so that consciousness could continue across a lifetime without being crushed by the accumulated weight of everything it had ever witnessed, ever thought, ever experienced. But Tesla chose, or was condemned to a different path. A path without dreams, without release, without the nightly mercy that makes human consciousness sustainable. And in walking that path, he showed us what happens when we refuse the oldest rhythm, when we deny the dissolution that allows renewal, when we insist that consciousness alone is sufficient and discover, too late, that it is not, that we need the dreams we do not dream, that wisdom lives in the spaces we refuse to visit, that the highest form of intelligence is knowing when to surrender, when to let go, when to close one's eyes and trust the darkness to sort what waking cannot sort, to process what consciousness cannot process, to make space for tomorrow by releasing yesterday into the dreams that Tesla would not have and so carried with him always, every moment, every thought, until the weight became unbearable and the self collapsed beneath it, leaving only questions about what might have been different if he had dreamed, if he had slept, if he had allowed the nightly dissolution that makes human existence possible, sustainable, bearable across the decades of accumulation that otherwise becomes chaos, becomes burden, becomes the dreams deferred that transform into the nightmare of waking consciousness that cannot rest, cannot stop, cannot find the release that only dreams provide, and that Tesla, in his refusal, proved we need more than we can possibly know until we try to live without them. It began as a humming, barely perceptible at first, a frequency at the edge of hearing that might have been real sound, or might have been the auditory cortex misfiring, might have been machinery in the distance, or might have been the neurons themselves vibrating from exhaustion, from the accumulated strain of consciousness that never paused, never rested, never allowed the systems that process sensation to power down and recalibrate. Tesla noticed it first in his 30s, though he did not mention it then. Did not speak of the sound that seemed to have no source, that persisted even in rooms where nothing hummed, where no electricity flowed, where silence should have been absolute but instead carried this underlying frequency, this presence that he could not locate in space, could not escape by moving, could not silence by covering his ears because it came from within, from somewhere deeper than the physical mechanisms of hearing, from territories where perception and generation blur together. At first, he believed it was his equipment. Of course he did. His laboratory filled with transformers and coils and apparatus that operated at frequencies designed to be barely audible, that produced electromagnetic fields strong enough to interfere with compasses blocks away, to make lights flicker in neighboring buildings. The humming, he thought, was simply the ambient noise of his work, the acoustic signature of the forces he had learned to command. But the humming persisted when the equipment was off. Continued in his hotel room, where no machinery existed. Followed him to parks, to restaurants, to the rare social gatherings he still attended in those days before isolation became complete. The sound was always there, just beneath conscious attention, like tinnitus but more structured, more insistent, carrying a quality that suggested intelligence, purpose, as though something was trying to communicate in a language composed entirely of frequency, of vibration, of the purest form of sound stripped of meaning, but heavy with significance. It is said that Tesla tried to measure it, tried to determine if the sound was objective phenomenon or subjective experience. He built instruments sensitive enough to detect vibrations that human hearing could not register, placed them in his hotel room while the humming filled his awareness, watched their needles remain perfectly still, indicating silence, indicating nothing while inside his skull the frequency continued. Undeniable, impossible to ignore, impossible to prove to anyone else who might confirm that yes, they heard it too. That he was not generating the sound himself through processes that had nothing to do with actual acoustic waves, that existed only in the firing patterns of a nervous system stretched too thin for too long. The instruments showed silence, but Tesla heard thunder. Some believe this was the beginning of the end. The first clear sign that sleeplessness had progressed beyond exhaustion into territory more dangerous, where the brain begins to generate its own signals, where perception becomes unreliable not occasionally, but constantly, where the boundary between what is sensed and what is imagined dissolves completely because the systems that maintain that boundary require rest to function, require the nightly recalibration that sleep provides, and without that recalibration they drift, lose their accuracy. Begin to report sensations that have no external source, but Tesla interpreted differently, called it sensitivity rather than symptom. Claimed that by refusing sleep, by maintaining consciousness through the hours when sensory processing normally powered down, he had developed abilities that others lacked, could sense electromagnetic fields directly, could hear frequencies beyond the normal range of human perception, could detect the presence of electrical current without instruments because his body itself had become instrument. His nervous system had become antenna. Receiving transmissions that the well-rested could not access because rest itself dulled the senses, closed the channels that he had learned to keep open through perpetual wakefulness. Perhaps there is truth in this. Perhaps the sleepless consciousness does become more sensitive, more permeable to stimuli that normally get filtered out. Perhaps Tesla could sense things that others missed, could detect electromagnetic fields through mechanisms that science has not yet mapped, that exist in territories where biology and electricity intersect in ways we are only beginning to understand. But even if the sensitivity was real, even if his claims were accurate, the question remains, was this gift or curse? Is it advantage to sense what others cannot sense, to hear what should remain inaudible, to have awareness so open, so receptive, so stripped of the normal filtering mechanisms that every electromagnetic field, every current, every vibration becomes presence in consciousness, becomes sound that cannot be silenced, becomes the constant background noise that makes silence itself impossible. Beneath the silence he claimed to hear through, beneath the humming that only he could detect, something else was growing. The frequency was changing, growing louder, developing harmonics. What had been barely noticeable became intrusive. What had been humming became ringing, became roaring, became the constant thunder that lived inside his skull, that had no off switch, no volume control, no way to reduce it except through the sleep he would not take, could not take, that might have allowed his auditory cortex to reset, to recalibrate, to return to some version of normal where silence was possible, and sound arrived only from external sources rather than generating perpetually from within. By his 50s, the thunder was his constant companion, more present than any human relationship, more reliable than any friend. Always there, always roaring, filling every moment with sound that no one else could hear, that he could describe but never share, that isolated him even more completely than his temporal displacement, his sleeplessness, his inability to synchronize with the rhythms that bound other humans together. Where memory fades and documentation grows sparse, we find glimpses of how he coped. Would avoid certain places where the sound grew worse, near power stations, near heavy machinery, near anything that generated strong electromagnetic fields that his hypersensitive nervous system would detect and translate into increased volume, into unbearable intensity of the thunder that never ceased, never paused, never granted him even a moment of the silence that others took for granted. would cover his ears sometimes, uselessly, hopelessly, knowing that the sound came from within but unable to resist the instinctive gesture, the body's futile attempt to block sensation that had no external source, that existed only in the firing patterns of neurons, so exhausted they had begun to create their own reality, their own signals, their own constant storm of activation that consciousness experienced as sound, as thunder. As the roaring that filled every moment and made concentration increasingly difficult, made thought increasingly chaotic, made the brilliant mind that had once seen so clearly begin to fragment under the assault of noise that would not stop, could not stop, that was not really noise at all, but the sound of a brain slowly destroying itself through the accumulated damage of decades without rest. Some believe he tried medications, tried remedies, tried everything that the primitive neurology of his era could offer to quiet the thunder, to reduce the volume, to grant him even brief respite from the constant roaring. But nothing worked, or nothing worked for long. The thunder was too deeply embedded, too thoroughly woven into the fabric of his consciousness, too fundamental to the way his nervous system now operated to be suppressed by any chemical, any intervention, any treatment except the one he could not accept: sleep, real sleep, deep sleep. The kind that lasts 8 hours and allows the brain to perform its essential maintenance, to quiet the hyperactive networks, to restore the filtering mechanisms that had broken down completely, that no longer distinguished between signal and noise, between sensation that should be attended to and sensation that should be ignored. Tesla could not sleep, and so the thunder continued, grew worse, became not just sound but presence, not just noise but entity. Something that seemed almost alive, almost aware, almost conscious in its own right, which it was, in a sense, because it was his consciousness, was the sound of his own brain screaming its distress, broadcasting its malfunction in the only language available. The constant, unrelenting, unbearable frequency that filled every moment of every sleepless hour across decades. Marked by this thunder, his later years took on a quality of desperation. The work continued, it always continued, but with increasing difficulty, increasing confusion, increasing inability to distinguish between ideas that made sense and ideas generated purely by a mind in chaos, by consciousness so disrupted by the constant internal noise that signal and nonsense became indistinguishable, both arriving with equal intensity, both demanding equal attention, both seeming equally valid because the mechanisms that might have sorted them, that might have separated insight from delusion, required the sleep he would not take, the rest he could not access, the silence he would never again experience. What does it mean to live with thunder in your skull, to never know quiet? To have every thought occur against a background of roaring that makes concentration an act of will so extreme it cannot be sustained, that can be managed only briefly before exhaustion forces release, forces the mind to drift into territories where the distinction between thinking and the noise of failed thinking becomes impossible to maintain. Perhaps this is what madness feels like. Not the dramatic break with reality that popular imagination pictures, but the slow accumulation of noise, the gradual filling of consciousness with signals that have no meaning, the progressive inability to distinguish between what is perception and what is malfunction, between what is insight and what is the brain's desperate attempt to make sense of its own chaos, to organize the thunder into patterns that might mean something, that might serve some purpose, that might justify the unbearable presence of sound that will not stop, cannot stop, that becomes the only constant in a life where everything else, clarity, purpose, connection, hope, has been eroded by the same sleeplessness that created the thunder in the first place. Some believe Tesla's electromagnetic sensitivity was real, that he could detect fields, could sense currents, could perceive dimensions of reality that instruments barely registered. And perhaps this is true. Perhaps his nervous system, kept perpetually alert, did develop abilities that others lacked. But even if this is true, even if the sensitivity was genuine, the cost was unspeakable. To sense everything, to filter nothing. To have consciousness so open that every electromagnetic fluctuation, every current, every field becomes presence in awareness, becomes sound that builds and builds until the cumulative effect is thunder, is roaring, is the constant assault that makes even the most brilliant mind begin to fail, begin to fracture. begin to lose its ability to distinguish between what is signal and what is noise generated by systems pushed so far past their limits that they can no longer function in any normal sense. The thunder lived in his skull, took up residence, became permanent tenant, permanent companion, permanent reminder that consciousness has requirements, that the brain needs rest, that sleeplessness extracts prices that become visible only after decades, only after the damage is so complete that repair becomes impossible, that the only option remaining is to continue, to endure, to carry the thunder through whatever years remain, knowing that it will never stop, never quiet. Never grant the mercy of silence that was forfeited the moment sleep became impossible, and the nervous system, deprived of its nightly recalibration, began to generate its own noise, its own chaos, its own constant reminder that some violations of natural law carry consequences that cannot be escaped, cannot be treated, cannot be anything except endured until consciousness itself finally, mercifully, ceases. Did the thunder stop when he died? Or did it continue, in some sense, as ghost presence, as echo, as reminder that the brain stretched too far does not return to normal, does not forgive, does not offer second chances, but only broadcasts its distress in frequencies that have no meaning except as warning? This is what happens when you refuse to rest. This is the sound of a mind destroying itself. This is the thunder that lives in the skull of anyone who believes they can transcend the body's needs, who thinks that consciousness alone is sufficient, who learns too late that the brain requires silence, requires rest, requires the nightly descent into darkness where thunder cannot follow, where noise dissolves into the blessed absence of sensation, where the self can finally, temporarily, know peace in the only place peace exists. In sleep that Tesla would not take, could not take, and paid for that refusal with decades of thunder, decades of roaring, decades of noise that was also the sound of genius destroying itself, one sleepless hour at a time, until nothing remained but the sound itself and the question that has no answer. Was it worth it? Was anything worth this? Could any insight, any innovation, any contribution to human knowledge possibly justify the price of never knowing silence again, of carrying thunder through every waking moment which was every moment until death provided the only rest available, the only silence left, the only escape from the noise that was not noise, but the sound of consciousness pushed so far beyond its limits that it had become something else entirely? A warning, a tragedy, a testament to the body's wisdom and the cost of ignoring it, written in frequencies only Tesla could hear, only he could endure, only he paid for with everything he was, until even the thunder could not distinguish between the mind that generated it and the malfunction it represented, between the genius and the damage, between the man and the noise that had consumed him completely. His hotel room had windows, large ones facing east, positioned to catch the morning light that announced each day's beginning to the city around him, but Tesla covered them. Not with ordinary curtains, not with the thin fabric that filters light while allowing some sense of the world beyond, but with heavy velvet, layer upon layer, hung with obsessive precision to ensure that not a single photon of external illumination could penetrate, that no hint of dawn or dusk, or the movement of sun across sky, could intrude upon the darkness he had chosen, the artificial night he maintained regardless of what hour the world outside insisted it was. It is said that he did this deliberately. Not from preference for darkness, he kept lights burning always, but from strategy, from the recognition that day and night as meaningful categories interfered with the work, with the continuous consciousness he had committed to maintaining, with the elimination of all rhythms except those he himself imposed through the mysterious cycles of his own exhaustion and brief, inadequate rest. In Tesla's chosen darkness, 3 in the afternoon looked identical to 3 in the morning. Time became abstract, became something measured not by the sun's reliable geometry, not by the ancient astronomical clock that had governed human existence since before we learned to count the hours, but by project completion, by the progressive stages of work, by the internal sense growing less reliable as years accumulated of when the body demanded its 2 hours of what he called rest, though rest without the reference point of night and day is something else entirely. Something unmoored from the cycles that give it meaning, that transform it from mere cessation into the nightly death and resurrection that binds human experience into coherent narrative. Beneath the silence of those curtained rooms he moved often, from hotel to hotel, building to building, but always the windows would be covered, always the external time eliminated lived a profound rejection. Not just of sleep, not just of the body's demands, but of something deeper. The shared rhythm that makes human beings into community, that synchronizes consciousness across millions of individual lives, that says morning is for waking and evening is for winding down and night is for the collective descent into darkness, where we meet each other not as separate individuals, but as part of something larger, something that transcends the isolated self. Tesla refused this synchronization, claimed exemption from the cycle, created spaces where time had no external reference, where consciousness could operate according to its own rules, its own patterns, its own mysterious logic that had nothing to do with planetary rotation, with the angle of light, with the biological inheritance that tells every cell in the body what hour it is, what state it should be preparing for, whether to be alert or to begin the cascade of changes that leads toward sleep. Some believe this was practical necessity. That Tesla's work required continuous attention, required the elimination of interruption, required the creation of environments where external time could not dictate internal state, where the demands of projects and experiments and visions could govern without the interference of a sun that set whether or not the work was complete, that rose whether or not consciousness was ready to resume. But those who visited him in these timeless rooms sensed something else. Sensed that the covered windows were not just tools, but symbols. That what Tesla had eliminated was not merely inconvenient light, but the fundamental connection to natural rhythm, to the cycles that govern not just human life, but all life, that existed before consciousness arose, and will continue after consciousness fades. That represents something older and wiser than any individual will, no matter how strong, no matter how determined to operate by different rules. Where memory fades into sparse accounts and uncertain chronology, we find descriptions of entering Tesla's rooms and experiencing disorientation so complete it bordered on vertigo. Not knowing what time it was, not knowing what day. Having lost, in the space of crossing a threshold, the basic orientation that humans require to make sense of existence, to place themselves in time, to know if they are at the beginning or middle or end of something, if sleep is approaching or has recently passed, if the body should be alert or preparing for rest. Tesla seemed immune to this disorientation, or claimed to be. Moved through his curtained spaces with certainty that suggested either complete adaptation or complete delusion, impossible to say which. Impossible to distinguish between someone who had successfully transcended the need for external time reference and someone who had lost the ability to recognize how profoundly unmoored he had become, how completely displaced from the shared experience that allows humans to coordinate, to communicate. To exist in any relationship more complex than the isolated self talking to itself in darkness that might be day or night or some strange hybrid state that exists nowhere in nature, that can be created only by will and velvet curtains, and the refusal to acknowledge that consciousness evolved to operate in rhythm with light and dark, with cycles that were not chosen but discovered, not imposed, but recognized as fundamental to the architecture of being alive. The lights in his rooms burned constantly. Not sunlight, not the warm spectrum that changes with hour and season, that carries information the body reads without conscious awareness, that tells the nervous system what state to prepare for, what chemistry to activate, what rhythms to follow, but artificial light. Gas flame at first, then electric, the same electricity he had mastered, now used to eliminate the very cycles that electricity was meant to supplement rather than replace, to extend day into evening but not to abolish night entirely, not to create the perpetual present that Tesla inhabited, where yesterday and tomorrow lost meaning because no marker distinguished one day from the next, where time became purely subjective, purely internal, purely untethered from anything that might anchor it to shared reality. What happens to consciousness that loses its temporal moorings? That exists in eternal present, in continuous now that has no past it reliably remembers, and no future it can confidently anticipate, because both past and future require the structure that day and night provide. the punctuation that transforms continuous time into discrete units, into days that can be counted, into nights that serve as boundaries between what was and what will be. Some believe Tesla achieved what he sought: liberation from time's tyranny, freedom from the body's insistence on cycles, the ability to work as long as inspiration lasted without the interruption of darkness saying stop, rest, this day is finished. But liberation and imprisonment can be difficult to distinguish when both involve losing connection to something fundamental, when both result in isolation from the shared experience that binds consciousness into community, into relationship, into the simple knowledge that others exist in the same moment you do, are experiencing the same transition from day to night, are synchronized in ways that make communication possible, that make coordination achievable, that prevent the complete solipsism of a self that has no external reference, that creates its own time in darkness where no one else can follow. Marked by the absence of markers, by the elimination of the very punctuation that makes time readable, Tesla's existence in these curtained rooms became increasingly abstract. Assistants who worked with him spoke of the difficulty, of arriving at what their watches said was morning to find him in a state that suggested evening, or arriving at evening to find him fresh and alert as though just waking, though he never woke because he never truly slept, never experienced the clean break between states that dawn and dusk facilitate, that make consciousness into a story with chapters rather than a continuous stream that has no beginning and no end, and no way to distinguish between what happened yesterday and what happened last week, because all of it exists in the same eternal present, the same now that stretches infinitely in all directions, that contains everything simultaneously, because nothing has been organized by the natural rhythm of day following night following day. The room where day never arrived was also the room where night never fell, where time itself became something ghostly, something suspect, something that Tesla controlled by eliminating it, or tried to control, or believed he controlled while actually becoming its prisoner, trapped in the eternal moment of his own creation, unable to escape into the natural flow of hours, because the natural flow requires reference points, requires the sun's movement, requires the body's recognition that one state is ending and another beginning. That consciousness moves through phases that cannot be sustained indefinitely, that must cycle or break. And Tesla's consciousness was breaking, not all at once, not in ways he could acknowledge, but the elimination of day and night was also the elimination of the structure that keeps the self coherent, that prevents total dissolution into chaos, that says this is now, and that was then, and something different will be later. Without this structure, memory becomes unreliable. Present experience becomes difficult to distinguish from recollection. The boundary between what is happening and what happened years ago grows uncertain because both exist in the same timeless present, the same eternal now where Tesla lived, where he had exiled himself, where he maintained his vigil in darkness that was also light, in the perpetual twilight of his own making. Some nights, though night had no meaning in his rooms, though the word itself was artifact from a natural cycle, he had rejected he would pause his work and realize he could not say how long he had been working. Hours, days. The question had no answer because the answer required reference to something external, some marker that would say when the work began relative to day's beginning or night's arrival. But there was no day, no night, only the continuous present in his curtained room where time moved at its own pace, or did not move at all, or moved in directions that had no correspondence to the time the rest of humanity inhabited, that flowed around his isolation like water around stone, continuing its cycle while he stood outside it, believing himself above it, not recognizing that he was not above but beneath, not transcendent but submerged, drowning slowly in timelessness that was also the absence of the very structure that makes human consciousness sustainable across decades. Did he know? Somewhere in the deepest part of himself, did Tesla recognize what he had done? That by eliminating external time he had eliminated himself from temporal existence, had made himself into ghost, into entity that had no clear location in the continuous flow that binds all other consciousness together. Did he understand that the covered windows were not liberation but imprisonment, that he had created not freedom but the most profound form of isolation? Temporal isolation, the exile from the shared flow of hours that allows humans to meet each other, to coordinate, to exist in any relationship that requires both parties to be in the same moment, the same now, the same point in the day-night cycle that gives all other nows their meaning. Perhaps he understood. Perhaps in moments of clarity, themselves impossible to locate in time, to say when they occurred relative to anything else he glimpsed what he had sacrificed. But understanding did not lead to change. Could not. Because change would require re-establishing connection to external time, would require removing the curtains, would require allowing day and night to return. And this would mean acknowledging that his entire experiment had failed, that consciousness cannot be sustained outside natural cycles, that the body's wisdom about rhythm and rest, and the alternation between states was not ignorance to be overcome, but knowledge to be honored. So the curtains remained. The windows stayed covered. And Tesla continued his existence in the room where day never arrived, where night never fell, where time had become purely abstract, purely subjective, purely the artifact of a consciousness that had lost its moorings, that drifted in eternal present without anchor, without reference, without the structure that would allow it to distinguish between now and then, between what is happening and what is remembered. Between the present moment and the accumulated weight of all other moments that exist simultaneously when time has been eliminated, when cycles have been rejected, when consciousness insists it can operate continuously without the punctuation that makes continuity meaningful, that transforms duration into narrative, that allows existence to be something other than the formless chaos of eternal now. The city outside continued its rhythm. Sun rose and set. People woke and slept. The shared dance of consciousness synchronized to planetary motion continued without him, around him, beyond the heavy curtains that marked the boundary between natural time and Tesla's time, between the flow that includes everyone and the isolation that includes only the self, only the consciousness that has refused to participate, that has chosen its own rhythm or discovered it has no rhythm at all, only the continuous present that is also continuous absence. Continuous disconnection from the cycles that make human existence not just possible, but bearable. And in that room, in that timeless space, in that darkness that was also artificial light, Tesla stood or sat or lay in his two-hour rest that was not sleep and not waking but something between. Something that belonged to no time of day because there was no time of day, only the eternal moment of his own making, the prison of his own design, the liberation that was also bondage, the freedom that was also the most complete form of isolation. To exist outside time while time continues without you, to live in eternal present while everyone else moves through past and future, to maintain consciousness continuously, while the very continuity destroys the structure that makes consciousness more than chaos, more than noise, more than the thunder that filled his skull, because there was no silence, no night, no darkness where the self could dissolve and reform, where time could work its essential magic of organizing experience into memory, of transforming continuous duration into discrete moments that can be ordered, understood, given meaning through their relationship to what came before and what will come after. But Tesla's after was not coming. His before had dissolved. And his now stretched infinitely in all directions, contained everything and nothing, was time and timelessness simultaneously, was the room where day never arrived because day requires night to give it definition, requires the cycle to make it meaningful, requires the rhythm that Tesla had eliminated in his pursuit of continuous consciousness, continuous work, continuous existence outside the natural cycles that govern all life, that cannot be refused without cost. That exact their price not immediately but slowly, over decades, in the progressive disconnection from shared reality, from temporal existence, from the simple knowledge of what hour it is, and what that hour means and whether consciousness should be preparing for rest or emerging from it knowledge that everyone else possessed automatically, unconsciously, but that Tesla had sacrificed, had traded for the ability to work in eternal present, to exist outside time. To live in the room where day never arrived and night never fell and time itself became meaningless, abstract, the ghost of something that once structured existence but now haunted it, reminder of what was lost in the pursuit of what could never be gained. Consciousness without cycles, existence without rhythm, Life lived outside the oldest pattern, the pattern that makes life possible, that Tesla rejected and paid for with everything, until even he could not say what time it was, could not remember what day, could only stand in his curtained room and rest and work again in patterns that had no relationship to anything external, anything shared. Anything that might connect him to the temporal flow, where the rest of humanity continued its ancient dance between light and dark, waking and sleeping, the rhythm he had abandoned, and that had abandoned him in return, leaving him stranded in eternal now that was also eternal nowhere, eternal absence from the time that continued without him, indifferent to his presence or absence, flowing on while he stood still in darkness that was light, in timelessness that was also the only time he had left. For years it worked. This is the truth that makes everything else more terrible. The sleeplessness was not immediately destructive, was not obviously dangerous, did not announce itself as the slow poison it would become. Instead, it seemed like advantage, like discovery. Like Tesla had found a secret that others missed, a method for optimizing consciousness beyond what nature intended, a way to extract more from existence by refusing to waste time in the darkness where awareness dissolves and hours pass unmarked, unwitnessed, lost to the nothingness of sleep. His thoughts were faster, demonstrably, measurably faster than those operating on adequate rest. He could hold more variables in mind simultaneously, could track multiple threads of reasoning without losing any, could maintain focus on problems so complex that others required notebooks to remember where they had left off. But Tesla needed nothing except the continuous consciousness that never paused, never reset, never forgot because it never stopped attending. The visions arrived with increasing frequency, complete machines appearing in his mind's eye. Solutions presenting themselves without the laborious calculation that others required. Insights emerging fully formed, as though sleeplessness had opened channels to understanding that rest normally keeps closed, that are accessible only to consciousness pushed past ordinary limits into territories where perception becomes more acute, where connections invisible to the well-rested suddenly become obvious, undeniable, revelatory. It is said that Tesla's most productive years coincided with his deepest sleeplessness. The alternating current motor, the Tesla coil, the demonstrations that made his name synonymous with electricity's mastery, with humanity's triumph over forces that had seemed forever wild, forever untamable, forever beyond the reach of consciousness, daring enough to remain alert while others slept, to work while others rested, to prove through sheer force of will and relentless wakefulness that genius could be sustained, amplified, transformed into something superhuman through the simple expedient of refusing to be merely human. Of declining sleep's invitation, of staying conscious when consciousness should have ceased. He was proof, he believed, that sleep was optional, that the human machine could be optimized beyond its default settings, that willpower could override biology's ancient demands, that consciousness, given sufficient determination, could operate continuously without the periodic dissolution that everyone else accepted as necessary, as inevitable, as the price of being alive. And for years, for decades, even the evidence supported his belief. The innovations emerged, the patents accumulated, the demonstrations astounded. Tesla's name grew famous, his methods admired, his capacity for work considered legendary. He had done it, had transcended limitation, had proven that the body's requirements were not laws but suggestions, not necessities but habits that could be broken by anyone willing to pay sufficient attention, to maintain sufficient discipline, to refuse the easy surrender that kept everyone else trapped in the rhythm of waking and sleeping, working and resting, that made them merely human while he became something more. But systems pushed beyond their design specifications do not fail gradually. Beneath the silence of his continuing productivity, beneath the outward appearance of sustained genius, something was accumulating, not visible at first, not measurable by any instrument he possessed, but real nonetheless. Damage, exhaustion at a level deeper than conscious awareness could detect. The slow erosion of systems that performed flawlessly, brilliantly, right up until the moment they didn't. And then they failed, not gradually. Not with warning signs that might have allowed correction, adjustment, the possibility of reversing course before catastrophe became inevitable. But suddenly, completely, Catastrophically. The way bridges collapse when stress exceeds tolerance, when metal that seemed solid reveals itself to have been weakening all along, invisibly, until the final load is applied and everything gives way at once. The clarity that had been his gift began to curdle. Some believe the change began around 1900, though pinpointing exact moments is difficult when dealing with consciousness, with the slow transformation of cognitive function that has no dramatic markers, no single instant when clarity becomes confusion, when insight becomes delusion, when the mind that was functioning brilliantly begins to malfunction in ways so subtle that even the mind experiencing the malfunction cannot recognize what is happening, cannot see that the tool it relies on to perceive reality has become unreliable, that perception itself has been compromised. His thoughts, which had flowed in straight lines from premise to conclusion, from problem to solution, from question to answer, began to spiral. Not immediately into chaos, not obviously into nonsense, but to curve back on themselves, to pursue tangents that led nowhere, to follow connections that seemed meaningful at first but revealed themselves, eventually, as meaningless, as products of a mind making patterns where no patterns existed, seeing relationships that had no basis in reality, generating significance from randomness, because the systems that normally distinguish between genuine insight and false connection had begun to fail, had been pushed too far for too long, had operated too many hours without the recalibration that sleep provides. Tesla began to notice, though not to acknowledge, not to speak of, not to recognize for what it was that problems which once yielded quickly to his analysis now resisted, that solutions which used to appear fully formed now fragmented before he could grasp them completely. That focus which had been laser precise, unwavering, capable of sustained attention that others envied, now scattered, wandered, pursued ideas that seemed important until he tried to articulate them and discovered they connected to nothing, meant nothing, were purely internal generation mistaken for external insight. The paranoia began subtly. A sense that his ideas were being stolen, that competitors were monitoring his work, that the insights he shared were being appropriated without credit. Some of this was true. Industrial espionage existed. Patents were contested. The world of electrical innovation was cutthroat, and Tesla's position in it was vulnerable. But the paranoia went beyond reasonable caution, beyond justified concern, into territories where every interaction became suspect, where everyone was potential thief, where trust became impossible because the mechanisms that normally distinguish between legitimate threat and imagined danger had broken down completely. Where memory fades into the fragmented accounts of those who knew him during this period, we find descriptions of a man transformed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, inexorably, the Tesla who had been brilliant, focused, capable of insights that changed the world, becoming someone else. Someone whose brilliance remained visible in flashes, but was increasingly buried beneath confusion, beneath the pursuit of theories that grew more elaborate and less connected to anything testable, to anything buildable, to anything that existed outside the territories accessible only to consciousness, so exhausted that it had lost its ability to distinguish between what was real and what it was generating from its own chaos. The compulsions intensified. The counting that had been occasional became constant. The avoidance of round objects that had been preference became absolute. New rituals emerged, having to touch things in groups of 3, having to enter buildings in specific ways, having to perform elaborate sequences of gestures before he could begin work. Gestures that had no purpose except to satisfy internal requirements that made no sense but could not be ignored, that dominated increasing amounts of his time and attention, that revealed a mind no longer fully under conscious control, no longer operating according to will alone, but hijacked by processes that arose from exhaustion so deep it had rewritten the very algorithms of thought. Some believe the most tragic aspect was Tesla's awareness, that he knew. That in moments of lucidity that became increasingly rare, increasingly brief, he could see what was happening to him, could recognize that the clarity was becoming confusion, that the mind that had served him so brilliantly was betraying him, was falling apart in ways he could observe but could not prevent, could not reverse, could not escape because the practices that had destroyed it were so thoroughly woven into his identity that changing them would require becoming someone else entirely. And by then, he no longer possessed the cognitive flexibility to become anyone other than what he had made himself. The man who would not sleep, whose consciousness could not cease, whose clarity had curdled into the confusion that now filled every waking hour, which was every hour, which was all the hours, which was time itself transformed into the continuous present, where past clarity and present confusion existed simultaneously, indistinguishably, making it impossible to say when the change had occurred because it had been occurring all along, invisibly, beneath the surface of apparent functionality. His grand theories proliferated: the unified field theory, the death ray, wireless power transmission on scales that would illuminate the world. Some of these ideas contained genuine insight remnants of the brilliance that had once operated so reliably. But increasingly, they were elaborated beyond testability, beyond practicality, beyond anything that could be built or verified, existing only in territories of pure speculation that Tesla defended with increasing vehemence, with arguments that grew more circular, more resistant to critique, more disconnected from the empirical grounding that had characterized his earlier work. He could not tell which ideas were brilliant and which were delusions. This is what the fragmented record suggests. That the same mind that had once discriminated so precisely between insight and error, between vision and fantasy, between what could be built and what was merely imagined, had lost that capacity. Everything now felt equally valid, equally important, equally demanding of attention. The brilliant and the nonsensical arrived with the same intensity, the same sense of revelation, the same insistence that this was important, this was real, this was understanding rather than the breakdown of understanding, insight rather than the ruins of insight. Marked by the turn of the century, by the accumulation of decades without adequate rest, Tesla's public pronouncements began to change quality, became more grandiose, more disconnected from practical demonstration, more focused on theories that could not be tested, on possibilities that could not be verified, on claims that grew more extraordinary while the evidence supporting them grew more sparse, more reliant on his personal authority, on his past achievements, on the reputation he had built when clarity was still possible, when consciousness still functioned reliably, when sleeplessness was advantage rather than the thing slowly destroying every system that made thought coherent, that made insight possible. That distinguished between understanding and the chaos that wears understanding's mask. The isolation intensified. Not just physical isolation, Tesla had always been solitary but cognitive isolation, the terrible aloneness of consciousness that can no longer reliably communicate with other consciousness because the shared framework of reality has been lost, has been replaced by internal reality so convincing that it seems objective, so elaborate that it appears systematic, so insistent that questioning it feels like questioning perception itself, like doubting whether you see what you see, whether you know what you know. Whether the insights that arrive with such clarity are insights at all or symptoms of a mind that has finally, after decades of abuse, begun its inevitable collapse. Did Tesla know? Could he distinguish in those final decades between the moments when his mind was functioning and the moments when it was malfunctioning? Could he tell which thoughts were reliable and which were artifacts of exhaustion? Could he recognize that the clarity was gone, that what remained was confusion wearing clarity's face, confidence replacing competence, the insistence of delusion that is always more certain than the tentativeness of genuine insight? The accounts suggest he could not. That by then, the confusion had become total. That the systems required to recognize malfunction had themselves malfunctioned. That consciousness had become its own echo chamber, generating and confirming its own reality, unable to access external reference points that might reveal the extent of the divergence between what Tesla perceived and what was actually occurring, between the theories he was generating and the physical world that would never confirm them because they existed only in territories accessible to a mind that had lost its moorings. That drifted in confusion it experienced as clarity. In chaos it mistook for order, in the wreckage of what had once been genius but had been pushed too far, sustained too long, denied the rest that might have preserved it. The price of those early productive years was being extracted. Not fairly, there is no fairness in this. Not proportionally, but absolutely, completely. The debt accumulated in silence, presented itself without warning, demanded payment, not in small installments, but in everything at once. The clarity that sleeplessness had initially enhanced became the clarity that sleeplessness destroyed. The advantage became catastrophe. The method that had produced genius produced, eventually, the ruins of genius, the fragments of a mind that had operated brilliantly until it couldn't, that had sustained insight until insight became impossible, that had proven against his own argument that consciousness has limits, that the human machine cannot be optimized beyond its design specifications without consequence, that willpower cannot override biology indefinitely, that eventually, inevitably, mercilessly, the bill comes due. And Tesla, standing in the wreckage of his own mind, surrounded by theories that grew more elaborate as they grew less connected to reality, by compulsions that consumed increasing amounts of his diminishing capacity, by the confusion that had replaced clarity so completely that he could no longer remember what clarity felt like, what it meant to think thoughts that followed logic rather than spiraling into themselves, what it was to distinguish between insight and symptom, between understanding and the elaborate performance of understanding that consciousness stages when it can no longer actually understand, but cannot admit this, cannot acknowledge what has been lost, because acknowledgement would require the very cognitive capacity that has been destroyed. Tesla proved what he had set out to disprove. That sleep is not optional, that rest is not negotiable, that consciousness sustained beyond its limits does not transcend but collapses, does not evolve but devolves, does not become superhuman but loses its humanity entirely, becomes something other than human but not in any positive sense, becomes chaos, becomes confusion, becomes the wreckage of what once worked brilliantly and now works not at all, leaving only the question that can never be answered. Was it worth it? Could anything possibly have been worth the price of clarity that became confusion, of insight that became delusion, of consciousness that remained always on until it was no longer truly conscious at all, until awareness itself had become artifact, had become purely internal generation with no external reference, had become the final, terrible demonstration that the body's wisdom about sleep was not ignorance to be overcome, but knowledge that punished its violation with the complete destruction of the very thing that believed it could be violated. The mind itself, which thought it was exempt, which learned too late that exemptions do not exist, that consciousness has requirements, that clarity sustained beyond its natural limits becomes confusion. And confusion, once established, admits no return to the clarity that was sacrificed, that was traded, that was lost the moment Tesla decided he could remain forever awake and discovered, slowly, inexorably. That forever awake is also forever lost in the confusion that replaces clarity when sleep is denied for too long, when wakefulness is extended past the point where wakefulness is sustainable, when consciousness insists on continuing until the only thing that continues is confusion, calling itself clarity, mistaking its own chaos for order, believing until the very end that the thoughts are still brilliant even as brilliance dies, even as clarity dissolves, even as everything that made consciousness functional collapses into the ruins where Tesla lived his final decades, unable to distinguish between past and present, between insight and error, between the genius he had been and the confusion he had become. In his final decades, when the inventions had stopped coming, when the money had run out, when the laboratory was memory, and the grand theories existed only in notebooks no one read, when even his legendary will could no longer fully mask the confusion that had replaced clarity, when everything else had been stripped away by time and exhaustion, and the accumulated cost of decades without rest in those final years, Tesla kept one practice. Every evening, as the sun descended, and the city prepared for its nightly transformation from day to night, from work to rest, from consciousness to the collective darkness he had refused to join, Tesla would leave his hotel room, would descend in the elevator, moving past doormen who had learned not to comment on his appearance, past lobbies where guests avoided eye contact with the wild-haired old man who muttered to himself, who counted his steps obsessively, who seemed to exist in a different reality than the one the rest of them inhabited. He would walk to the park. To Madison Square, to Bryant Park, to the plaza in front of the library, to the places where pigeons congregated even after the sun had set, even in the hours when most birds roosted, when the city belonged to cats and rats and the human insomniacs who shared Tesla's displacement from normal temporal rhythms. It is said that he carried seed in his pockets. Always. Heavy bags of it that he purchased with money he could not afford to spend. That weighed down his thin frame, that marked him as strange even in a city that tolerated strangeness with remarkable indifference. The seed mattered more than food for himself, more than rent he struggled to pay, more than anything except the continued connection to creatures who had become not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally his only companions, his only relationships, his only experience of connection that did not require synchronization with rhythms he could no longer follow, that did not demand he explain himself, that accepted his presence without judgment or expectation or the silent questioning he saw in human eyes that looked at him and wondered what had happened, what had gone wrong, why this man who had once been celebrated now seemed barely human, seemed more like ghost, like remnant, like the ruins of someone who had been extraordinary before something unmade him completely. The pigeons did not judge. This was perhaps their first gift. Their most fundamental offering in the economy of relationship that had developed between Tesla and these creatures who existed at the margins of human space, who were neither wild nor domestic, who occupied the boundary territories between nature and civilization, who lived in the city but were not of it, who survived on what humans discarded and asked nothing except to be allowed to exist, to feed, to continue their mysterious lives according to rhythms that had nothing to do with human schedules, human purposes, human time. He would scatter the seed, would stand in the gathering darkness while birds descended around him, dozens of them at first, then hundreds as word spread through whatever communication system pigeons use, whatever signals alert them that food is available, that this particular human is safe, is reliable, is the one who comes every evening and offers what they need without asking anything in return except perhaps their presence, their willingness to approach, to eat from his hand, to allow him to exist among them for a little while in the evening hours when loneliness became most acute, most unbearable, most likely to reveal itself as the fundamental condition of his existence now that everything else had fallen away. Beneath the silence of these encounters, beneath the simple transaction of seed offered and accepted, something deeper lived. Connection, relationship. The kind that arises when consciousness is so starved for companionship that even the presence of birds becomes essential, becomes necessary, becomes the only form of contact that doesn't require him to be anything other than what he had become. Someone damaged, someone strange, someone who existed outside normal parameters and found that outside was a lonely place, populated only by others who existed there too, the pigeons, the rats, the stray cats, the creatures who lived in the gaps of human civilization and who recognized him, perhaps, as one of their own, as someone who had fallen through the cracks, who no longer fit anywhere except in these marginal spaces where the lost things gathered. Some believe this was madness. That Tesla's devotion to pigeons was symptom of his deterioration, evidence that sleeplessness had finally destroyed his ability to form appropriate attachments, to distinguish between human and animal, between relationships that made sense and relationships born purely from desperation, from the terrible need for connection that consciousness cannot survive without, that will grasp at anything, even birds. Even creatures incapable of returning affection in any human sense rather than exist in complete isolation, in the utter solitude that his sleeplessness and strangeness and temporal displacement had created around him like walls so complete that only creatures who existed outside human social structures could cross them. But those who witnessed him with the birds spoke of something else. Spoke of gentleness that seemed to come from parts of him that the laboratory work had never accessed, that the electrical experiments had never touched, that remained somehow preserved despite everything else that had been destroyed. He would speak to them in soft voices, would murmur words that bystanders couldn't quite hear, that seemed meant only for the birds, that carried a tenderness that was startling in a man whose eyes often held wildness, whose hands trembled constantly, whose entire bearing suggested someone barely holding himself together through sheer force of a will that was itself fragmenting, that was itself becoming unreliable even as it remained the only thing keeping him from complete dissolution. He had favorites. Of course he did. Would recognize individuals claim to recognize them from their markings, from their behavior, from the way they responded to his presence. Would give them names, would speak of their personalities as though pigeons possessed individuality, as though each bird was not merely member of a species but particular consciousness with preferences, habits, character traits that made it unique, made it worthy of attention, made it into someone rather than something. Where memory fades into the uncertain testimony of witnesses who were themselves uncertain what they had seen, what they had understood, whether the old inventor was simply mad, or whether something genuine lived in these relationships despite their strangeness. We find accounts of Tesla singling out particular birds, of calling to them specifically, of waiting for certain individuals to appear before he would scatter seed, of the concern he showed when familiar birds didn't arrive. When expected presences were absent, and he would stand in the gathering darkness longer than usual, waiting, hoping, worrying about creatures that most humans considered vermin, that most people tried to discourage rather than encourage, that existed at the very bottom of urban consciousness as things to be tolerated at best, eliminated at worst. And then there was the white one. It is said that she appeared sometime around 1920, though the chronology is uncertain, though by then Tesla's relationship to time had become so disordered that dating anything precisely was nearly impossible. But she appeared. A female pigeon, white body, gray-tipped wings, eyes that Tesla claimed held intelligence, recognition, perhaps even affection. She would come to his window. Not to the park, not to the plaza, but to the window of his hotel room on the 33rd floor, where no pigeon should be able to navigate, where the appearance of any bird would be unusual but her appearance became regular, reliable. The one thing in Tesla's increasingly chaotic existence that arrived when expected, that maintained consistency, that demonstrated to him at least that connection was possible, that consciousness could reach across the species boundary. That he was not utterly alone even though human companionship had become impossible, had been sacrificed to the sleeplessness and strangeness that marked him as too far outside normal parameters to include in any human community. He spoke of loving her, not in metaphorical sense, not as figure of speech, but plainly, directly, with an intensity that shocked those who heard it. He loved this pigeon as a man loves a woman. These were his words, his claim. His insistence against the skepticism, the concern, the suggestion that this was delusion, that he was confusing species, that this was symptom rather than genuine emotion. But perhaps it was both. Perhaps the love was real as anything Tesla felt in those final decades, and also symptom of how completely isolated he had become, how thoroughly disconnected from human relationship, how desperate for connection that would transcend the boundaries his sleeplessness had created. Perhaps both interpretations are true simultaneously. That he genuinely loved this creature, and that the love was possible only because he had lost the capacity for more appropriate attachments, had been driven so far into solitude that even a pigeon's presence could become essential, could become the center of emotional life, could carry weight that should have been distributed across multiple relationships, but had nowhere else to go. No other recipient except this white bird who came to his window and allowed him to believe, for a little while, that he mattered to someone, that his presence meant something beyond the fading legend, beyond the patents that had made others rich, beyond the recognition that had long since turned to pity or dismissal, or the polite embarrassment of a world that had moved on while he remained frozen in patterns established decades earlier, patterns that had destroyed him, but that he could not abandon because they were all he had left. Marked by the years, the relationship deepened, became ritual, became necessity. Tesla would wait for her each evening, would become anxious if she was late, would experience relief so visible that witnesses described it as profound when she finally appeared, settling on the windowsill, meeting his gaze or seeming to meet his gaze, or him believing she met his gaze, which amounted to the same thing for someone whose reality had become so thoroughly internal that external confirmation no longer mattered, no longer signified, no longer held any authority over what he knew he experienced. what he felt, what he believed with certainty that no skepticism could shake. He would speak to her, would tell her things he told no one else, his theories, his plans, his memories of the years when clarity was still possible, when consciousness functioned reliably, when he was celebrated rather than pitied. She listened or seemed to listen, or he believed she listened. Would cock her head at certain statements, would remain still at others, would occasionally make soft sounds that Tesla interpreted as response, as understanding, as confirmation that yes, she knew, she understood. She recognized what he was saying even if no human could follow him anymore, even if his thoughts had become so tangled with confusion that communication with other humans had become nearly impossible. Had devolved into fragments and non sequiturs and claims so extraordinary that even those who wanted to believe him couldn't bridge the gap between what he said and what seemed possible, what made sense, what existed in shared reality rather than in territories accessible only to consciousness that had been damaged beyond repair. Some believe the pigeon became more real to him than people. That in his internal landscape, in the geography of relationships that consciousness maintains, this bird occupied central position, carried more emotional weight than any human connection, meant more to him than fame or recognition or the possibility that his work might someday be properly understood, properly appreciated by a world that had dismissed him, that had moved on to other inventors, other innovations, other genius while he remained behind. Trapped in practices that had long since stopped serving him, but that he could not abandon, could not modify, could not escape even when they isolated him completely, even when they reduced him to the man who talked to pigeons, who spent money he didn't have on seed, who was more concerned with whether a particular bird appeared than with his own survival, his own health. His own slow dissolution into poverty and obscurity, and the kind of loneliness that has no remedy because the person experiencing it has become too strange for human connection, too damaged for normal relationship, too far displaced from shared reality to find his way back even if he wanted to. Even if he recognized that the pigeon's love, if it was love, could not sustain human consciousness, could not provide what he truly needed, could not repair what decades of sleeplessness had broken. And then she died. The accounts are unclear about when, about how Tesla learned of it, about whether he witnessed the death or simply knew, simply felt her absence with a certainty that required no physical confirmation. But he claimed, and those who knew him believed his claim was sincere, was not performance, was not delusion but genuine experience, that he received a message at the moment of her death. Light appeared in his room. Not ordinary light, he was specific about this, insistent. But light unlike anything he had seen before, light that seemed to carry meaning, that communicated something beyond mere illumination. And he knew she was gone, knew before any physical evidence could confirm it. Knew with absolute certainty that the one relationship that had sustained him through the final difficult decades had ended, that the connection was broken, that he was now more alone than he had ever been because even the pigeons, even the creatures who had not judged him, who had accepted his presence without question, even they were leaving him, or being taken from him, or demonstrating that nothing is permanent, that every connection ends. That consciousness can lose even the most marginal relationships if it lives long enough, if it exists long enough in isolation, if it refuses the cycles that bind others together, and discovers that refusal means watching everything slip away while you remain, alone, witnessing loss after loss, until even birds can be mourned with intensity that shocks those who observe it. Who see the old man weeping for a pigeon and don't know whether to feel pity or contempt or simply confusion at the sight of genius reduced to this, to grief for a creature that most humans would not notice, that existed at the very margins of consciousness. That should not matter, but that mattered to Tesla more than anything else by then. More than his work, more than his legacy, more than the fame he had lost or the recognition he would never regain, more than life itself perhaps. Because the pigeon represented something irreplaceable. Proof that connection was still possible, that consciousness could reach beyond itself and touch another consciousness. However alien, however different, however impossible the relationship seemed to everyone else who could not understand what it meant to be so isolated that even a bird's presence could be precious, could be essential, could be the only thing standing between complete solitude and the kind of companionship that makes existence bearable. That makes continued consciousness seem worthwhile rather than burden to be endured until it finally, mercifully, ends. Some believe something broke in Tesla when she died. Something that had not been broken before despite everything else that had been damaged, had been destroyed, had been lost to the sleeplessness and the confusion and the isolation. Something essential. Something that had kept him functioning despite the odds, despite the deterioration, despite the recognition that his best years were behind him. That clarity would not return. That confusion was his permanent state now, but functioning nonetheless, maintaining some connection to life, to purpose, to the belief that existence still held meaning even if that meaning was only the evening ritual of feeding birds, of maintaining relationships that others dismissed, but that to him were everything. After her death, the accounts suggest a man hollowed, going through motions, still feeding the pigeons he never stopped, even in his final weeks, but differently now, without the same engagement, without the same tenderness. As though the other birds were simply birds now, as though whatever had made the white one special had also made all pigeons special by association. And with her gone, the magic was gone, the connection was severed, leaving only the ritual, the habit, the mechanical repetition of actions that no longer carried meaning, but that he performed anyway because they were all he knew, all he had left, all that remained of the practices that had structured his existence after everything else had been stripped away. Did the pigeons mourn him? This is perhaps the wrong question, projecting human emotion onto creatures that may not experience loss the way consciousness does, that may simply note the absence of food when he finally stopped coming, stopped appearing at the evening hour, stopped scattering seed in parks where birds still gathered, waiting for someone who would never return, who had kept vigil with them through decades of evenings but had finally ceased, had finally surrendered to the exhaustion that could no longer be denied. That had extracted its final payment and left the parks emptier, the pigeons less fed, the evening darkness more complete for the absence of the strange old man who had loved them in his way, who had found in them what he could not find among his own species. Acceptance without judgment, presence without demands, companionship that required nothing except showing up, scattering seed, being there in the evening hours when loneliness was most acute and connection. However strange, however impossible it seemed to others, was necessary for survival, was the only thing standing between consciousness and complete dissolution into solitude so profound that even sleep, if he had been capable of sleep, could not have offered respite, could not have provided relief, could not have done anything except demonstrate that he was alone even in darkness, even in the territory where most humans meet each other in the collective unconscious, in the shared dreams that Tesla had never accessed, had never visited, had never known except as absence, as the thing he refused, and that refused him in return, leaving him awake, always awake, with only pigeons for company in the long hours when everyone else descended into the darkness he would not enter, could not enter. And so stood alone, so completely alone, in the vast empty space of consciousness without connection, without the rhythms that bind people together, without anything except birds who came when he called and stayed until they didn't, until they died or flew away or simply disappeared into the city that had long since forgotten the man who had once illuminated it, who had once been celebrated, who had once been genius before genius curdled into confusion, before clarity became chaos, before everything was lost except the pigeons, and then even they were gone, even they could not stay, leaving Tesla in his final years more alone than any consciousness should have to be, more isolated than any mind can survive, more displaced from human connection than sleeplessness itself could fully explain, though sleeplessness explained enough, explained everything perhaps. That consciousness requires rest, requires rhythm, requires the cycles that allow connection, and without those cycles there is only isolation, only the pigeons that kept vigil while they could, that stayed as long as they stayed. But that eventually, inevitably, left him alone in the darkness that was not darkness because his eyes never closed, in the solitude that was complete because he had refused every practice that might have prevented it, in the loneliness that no pigeon, however loved, however essential, could ultimately remedy because the loneliness was structural, was built into the very architecture of sleeplessness, of consciousness that will not rest, of existence outside the rhythms that make human life with all its connection, all its community, all its possibility for companionship sustainable across the decades that Tesla survived but did not truly live, not in any human sense, not in any way that included the connections that make survival meaningful, that make continued consciousness something other than burden, that make the years add up to life rather than merely duration, merely time marked without meaning except the evening ritual of feeding birds who, blessedly, did not judge, did not question, did not require anything except seed and presence, and the willingness to stand in the gathering darkness offering what little he had left to creatures who asked nothing more, who gave nothing more, but whose presence was enough until it wasn't. Until even they could not fill the void, until even their vigil ended and Tesla stood alone, completely alone, in the darkness that was light, in the solitude that was his only companion, in the final years where even pigeons could not save him from the isolation that sleeplessness had created, that decades of wakefulness had carved around him like walls so high, so complete, that nothing could cross them, nothing could reach him. Nothing remained except memory of the white pigeon who had loved him or had seemed to love him, which for Tesla was the same thing, was sufficient, was all he had and more than he deserved, given what he had done to himself, given what he had refused, given that the loneliness was not inflicted, but chosen, or chosen initially before choice became impossible, before pattern became prison, before the vigilance he maintained became the thing that destroyed every possibility of the connection he needed. That every consciousness needs, that even genius cannot survive without though Tesla tried for decades, tried until the very end, until the pigeons were all he had, and then the pigeons were gone and then there was nothing, nothing except the thunder in his skull and the confusion in his mind, and the loneliness so complete that even death, when it came, might have felt less like ending and more like the first companionship he had experienced in years, the first presence that asked nothing. The first darkness that did not judge, the first rest that required no performance, no vigil, no consciousness that must remain forever awake and forever alone because awake and alone had become synonyms, had become one thing, had become the only thing, had become his entire existence until existence itself ended, and the vigil ceased, and the pigeons, wherever they were, continued their mysterious lives without him, without seed. Without the strange old man who had loved them in his damaged way, and found in them the only love that sleeplessness had left him capable of receiving, the only connection that insomnia had not destroyed, the only companionship that decades of wakefulness had not driven away until, finally, it had, until even that was gone, until Tesla stood alone in the final darkness that was not darkness, because darkness requires closed eyes and Tesla's eyes never closed, never rested. Never knew the mercy that might have saved him if he had accepted it before it was too late, before the damage was complete, before the isolation became so total that even birds could not bridge it, could not reach him, could only keep their vigil until they couldn't, until they flew away into the evening sky and left him standing in the park, alone, always alone, with empty hands still reaching toward a sky that would not answer, that had never answered. That held no response for consciousness that remained always awake and always, always, unbearably alone. Electricity seeks ground. This is fundamental law. This is the principle that governs every circuit, every flow, every movement of electrons through conductors toward the earth that waits to receive them, to neutralize them, to return potential to zero, energy to rest, the charged state to the neutral state where nothing moves, nothing flows, nothing carries the tension of imbalance seeking resolution. Every electrical system requires this. Requires the path to ground that allows discharge, that prevents the dangerous accumulation of voltage with nowhere to go, that provides release for energy that cannot remain suspended indefinitely without consequences, without damage to the systems that carry it, without the risk of catastrophic failure when the charge becomes too great and finds its own path unpredictable, uncontrolled, destructive rather than following the safe route that human engineering provides. Tesla understood this. Understood it with a precision that few others achieved. Built it into every system he designed, every circuit he created, every apparatus that channeled forces capable of killing anyone who failed to respect the necessity of ground, who failed to provide the path that allows electricity to complete its journey, to discharge its potential, to return to the neutral state that makes continued operation sustainable. But Tesla himself carried current that would not ground. It is said that if you had touched him in his later years, though no one did, though his isolation and strangeness prevented physical contact, though he himself could not bear to touch or be touched, you might have felt it. Not electricity in the literal sense, though perhaps that too. Perhaps the electromagnetic fields he claimed to sense had made his body itself into conductor, into antenna, into vessel for forces that normally remained external, but that he had internalized through decades of exposure, of working at voltages that should have killed him, but that he survived, that he incorporated, that became part of him in ways that blurred the boundary between biological and electrical, between the man and the forces he commanded. But beyond the literal electricity, beyond the measurable voltages and currents and fields, Tesla carried something else. Energy that had no outlet, potential that could not discharge. The accumulated charge of consciousness that never powered down, never rested, never found the neutral state that sleep provides, that allows the nervous system to release its accumulated tension, to return to zero, to ground itself in the darkness where all humans meet the earth, where consciousness touches the source, where the circuit completes and energy flows freely because resistance has been released, because the path to ground has been opened, because rest allows what wakefulness cannot. The discharge that prevents dangerous accumulation, that maintains balance, that keeps the system from overloading and destroying itself through the very energy it was designed to carry. Tesla's nervous system was a circuit perpetually energized, neurons firing without cessation, thoughts racing along pathways that never completed, that never found resolution, that left him forever in the state of potential without release, of energy flowing but finding no ground, no terminus, no point at which the movement could cease and neutrality return, and the system could rest before the next cycle began. Beneath the silence of his sleepless nights, beneath the relentless activity of consciousness that would not stop, this was perhaps the deepest truth. That Tesla existed in permanent imbalance, in perpetual charge, in the state that electrical systems can maintain only briefly before requiring discharge, before needing ground, before the accumulated potential becomes dangerous, unstable, seeking any path safe or destructive that might allow release. Some believe this explains his fascination with alternating current, the electricity that reverses direction constantly, that never settles, that embodies in physical form the principle of perpetual motion without rest, without the steady flow that reaches destination and stops. That this form of electrical energy resonated with Tesla's internal state in ways he may not have consciously recognized, but that shaped his innovations nonetheless. That made him the perfect inventor for this particular technology because he lived its principle, embodied its restlessness, understood in his flesh what it meant to carry energy that could not discharge, that reversed and alternated and continued endlessly without the resolution that direct current offers, without the simple flow from source to ground that allows completion, allows rest, allows the circuit to fulfill its purpose, and then cease until needed again. His body was alternating current. This is not metaphor. This is description of what happened when consciousness was never allowed to complete its natural cycle, when the flow from waking to sleeping was interrupted, when energy accumulated without the nightly discharge that transforms potential into neutral, tension into rest, the charged state into the ground state that makes next charging possible, sustainable, part of cycle rather than accumulation toward catastrophe. Where does energy go when it cannot ground? In electrical systems, the answer is clear. It builds, creates dangerous voltages, seeks unintended paths, eventually finds discharge through whatever conductor presents itself, through insulation that breaks down, through air that ionizes, through the destructive arc that occurs when potential becomes too great and the system fails catastrophically, all at once, releasing in an instant what should have been released gradually, safely, through proper grounding. In human consciousness, the principle is the same though the mechanisms differ. Energy that cannot discharge accumulates, builds pressure, creates states that are sustainable briefly but become dangerous when extended indefinitely. The nervous system, denied its nightly return to neutral, begins to malfunction, Neurons remain activated when they should rest. Pathways stay open when they should close. The brain, designed to operate in cycles of charge and discharge, of activity and rest, of conscious energy and unconscious grounding, instead remains in permanent activation, permanent potential, permanent imbalance that it interprets as normal because it has known nothing else for so long that abnormal has become its baseline, that pathology has become its operating state. Tesla described feeling this. Described the sense of electricity moving through him constantly, of energy that had no outlet, of the restlessness that was not psychological but physiological, was not mood but state, was not something he could will away but something he inhabited, something that inhabited him, something that arose from the fundamental mismatch between how his consciousness was operating and how consciousness is designed to operate in cycles, in rhythms, in the alternation between charge and discharge that he had eliminated, that he had replaced with permanent charge, with current that could not ground, with energy that had nowhere to go except through the circuits of his own being, wearing them down, burning them out, slowly destroying the very system it should have sustained. Marked by the decades of sleeplessness, marked by the accumulation of years without proper discharge, Tesla's internal state began to resemble his worst experimental failures. The apparatus that could not handle the voltages it was asked to carry, the circuits that broke down under sustained load, the systems that worked brilliantly until they didn't, until accumulated stress revealed weaknesses that normal operation would never have exposed, that became visible only when the system was pushed beyond its specifications, beyond its design limits, beyond the tolerances that safe operation requires. His hands trembled with current that had nowhere to go. His mind raced with thoughts that found no resolution. His entire being vibrated at frequencies that should have been temporary, should have been followed by the grounding that allows return to neutral. But that instead became permanent, became his constant state, became the hum that underlay every moment because the circuit could not complete, could not discharge, could not find the ground that was sleep, that was rest, that was the darkness where energy releases and potential returns to zero, and the system, finally, briefly, knows peace. Some believe Tesla's sensitivity to electromagnetic fields was real, was the result of his nervous system becoming so attuned to electrical phenomena that it could detect what instruments barely measured. But perhaps the causation ran the other direction. Perhaps the sensitivity was not gift, but symptom, was not ability but malfunction, was the result of a nervous system so overcharged, so unable to ground itself, so perpetually activated that it began to respond to stimuli that should have been filtered out, that normal consciousness ignores because normal consciousness grounds regularly, discharges nightly, returns to neutral in the darkness where the self temporarily releases its charge and wakes refreshed, rezeroed, ready to accumulate potential again without the dangerous buildup that occurs when discharge never happens, when grounding never occurs, when the circuit remains forever open, forever energized, forever carrying current that seeks ground but cannot find it. Did Tesla understand this parallel between his life's work and his internal state? Did he recognize that he had become, in some sense, the embodiment of his own innovations, the alternating current that never settles, the wireless transmission that seeks no ground, the energy that flows perpetually without terminus, without rest, without the completion that allows sustainable operation? The accounts suggest he did not, or did not articulate it if he did. But the parallel was there nonetheless, written in the trajectory of his life, in the way his innovations reflected his condition, in the strange symmetry between the electricity he mastered externally and the electricity he could not master internally, between the forces he controlled through his apparatus and the forces that controlled him through his own nervous system, between the grounding he carefully provided for his machines and the grounding he denied himself, that he could not achieve. That remained forever out of reach because reaching it would require sleep, and sleep was impossible, was the ground that consciousness could not find no matter how desperately it sought, no matter how much the system needed discharge, needed neutral, needed the blessed zero state where nothing flows because everything has been released, where rest is possible because potential has been allowed to complete its journey, to find its ground. to return to the earth that waits patiently to receive what cannot be carried indefinitely without cost. He built systems that grounded perfectly, built them with precision that prevented the dangerous accumulation of charge, that allowed safe operation at voltages that would kill if mishandled, that demonstrated his profound understanding of how energy must flow, must complete its circuit, must find ground or destroy whatever carries it. But he could not ground himself, could not provide for his own consciousness what he provided for his machines, could not design the circuit that would allow his own discharge, his own return to neutral, his own nightly journey to the zero state where humans are meant to go, where consciousness touches ground and releases its accumulated charge and wakes capable of carrying more because it has released what it carried, because discharge makes room for recharge, because grounding makes sustainable what would otherwise become catastrophic. The current flowed through him endlessly, through neurons that never rested, through pathways that never closed, through circuits that remained activated decades past the point where activation should have given way to rest, where energy should have found its ground, where potential should have returned to zero so that the next cycle could begin fresh, balanced, sustainable. But Tesla's cycle never completed, never found its ground, never reached zero. Just continued alternating perhaps, reversing direction, changing focus from one project to another, from one theory to the next, but never stopping, never discharging, never knowing the peace of the ground state, the rest of neutrality, the mercy of the zero where nothing is demanded. Nothing is charged, nothing flows because everything has been released into the darkness that accepts all, that judges nothing, that receives whatever consciousness needs to discharge and asks nothing in return, except the surrender that Tesla could not make, the admission that he needed ground, needed rest, needed the nightly return to zero that he had refused so long that refusal became inability. That choice became compulsion, that the current which should have grounded could not ground, could only continue until the system that carried it failed completely, catastrophically, all at once. The way electrical systems fail when they are pushed beyond tolerance, beyond design specifications, beyond the limits that safe operation requires. He was the wire that carried too much voltage, the circuit that never completed, the system perpetually energized beyond sustainable load. And the ground he needed was the ground he could not reach, was sleep, was rest, was the darkness where all circuits complete and all potential discharges, and all energy returns to the earth that waits to receive it, that has always waited, that would have received him if he had allowed it, if he had not insisted on remaining forever charged, forever active, forever carrying current that sought ground, but could not find it because the one seeking was also the obstacle. Because Tesla himself was both the energy-seeking discharge and the resistance preventing it, both the potential seeking neutral and the will that denied neutrality, both the current that needed ground and the consciousness that refused to ground, that could not ground, that remained forever suspended in the state between, forever carrying charge that had nowhere to go, forever vibrating at frequencies that should have been temporary but became permanent, became his essence, became what he was. The current that would not ground, the energy that would not rest, the electricity that was also human consciousness pushed so far beyond its natural cycle that it became something else, something that resembled electricity more than humanity, that obeyed electrical principles because it had forgotten biological ones, that flowed according to laws of charge and potential because it had abandoned the laws of sleep and waking, of rest and activity, of the ground state that makes all other states possible. Sustainable, bearable, the earth was waiting, is always waiting, waiting to receive what cannot be carried indefinitely, what must be released periodically or destroy the vessel that contains it. Waiting with infinite patience for consciousness to ground itself, to discharge its accumulated potential, to return to zero in the darkness where grounding happens, where rest lives, where the circuit completes and energy flows home to the source that birthed it. That will birth it again tomorrow when consciousness wakes refreshed, because it has released what it carried, because it has grounded what could not remain suspended, because it has accepted what Tesla could not accept. That we are not meant to carry current indefinitely, that consciousness requires discharge, that the ground state is not failure but necessity, not weakness but the very thing that makes strength possible, that allows us to carry charge tomorrow because we released it tonight. That makes sustainable what becomes catastrophic when we refuse, when we insist on remaining forever energized, forever potential, forever seeking ground we will not allow ourselves to reach. Tesla stood ungrounded. Carried current that sought Earth but could not find it. Was the circuit that never completed, the energy that never rested, the electricity that flowed until it destroyed the very system it was meant to animate. And in his destruction lived the lesson he never learned, the truth he could not accept. That ground is not optional, that discharge is essential, that consciousness pushed beyond its natural cycles becomes electricity without Earth, current without completion, potential that builds and builds until it finds release through catastrophic failure rather than the safe, nightly grounding that was always available, was always waiting, was the darkness he feared when he should have embraced it, was the rest he denied when he needed it most. Was the ground that would have saved him if he had allowed consciousness to complete its circuit, to discharge its load, to return to zero in the blessed darkness where all energy finds its home, where all circuits complete, where the current that flowed so long without rest could finally, mercifully, ground itself, and know the peace that Tesla spent his life avoiding, that he paid everything to refuse, that remained forever just beyond his reach, because reaching it required surrender, required rest. Required the one thing his consciousness could no longer do. Let go, power down, return to the Earth that was waiting, that is always waiting, that will receive us all eventually when the current stops flowing not because we choose, but because the system finally, inevitably, fails, and we find the ground we needed all along, the ground we should have touched nightly, the ground that would have sustained us if we had not been too proud, too stubborn, too convinced of our own invincibility to admit that consciousness has limits, that energy requires discharge, that the current must ground or it destroys what carries it, leaves only the wreckage of the system that insisted it could remain forever charged, forever active, forever ungrounded until grounding was no longer choice but consequence, no longer surrender but collapse, no longer rest but the final discharge from which there is no waking, no recharging, no return. The current stops. Eventually. Always. And when it stops for Tesla, in that hotel room in 1943, perhaps what he finally found was the ground he had sought unconsciously through all those decades of sleepless searching, the zero state his nervous system had needed, the discharge that comes when consciousness itself grounds permanently, completely, in the darkness that is not sleep but the end of all sleeping, the rest that is not temporary but eternal, the grounding that requires no waking because there will be no more waking. Only the piece of potential returned to zero, of energy released to Earth, of the current that finally, at last, found the ground it needed, that Tesla's body found even though his will never surrendered, that the system found when the system failed and all the accumulated charge of decades discharged at once into the final darkness, the ultimate ground, the zero. January 7, 1943. Room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel. The Do Not Disturb sign hung on the door handle, its message clear, its instruction unambiguous. Tesla had placed it there 2 days prior or perhaps 3, the timeline uncertain, as time had become uncertain for him in those final years, in those final months, in those final hours when consciousness itself had grown unreliable, when the boundary between waking and whatever strange state he inhabited instead of waking had dissolved completely. The maid knocked, received no answer, knocked again, nothing. The protocol was clear: respect the sign, respect the guest's privacy, return later when perhaps the old inventor had emerged from whatever work occupied him, whatever visions kept him sequestered in the room where curtains remained drawn and time held no meaning, and the rhythms that governed the rest of the hotel, the rest of the city, the rest of human existence did not apply. But concern accumulated. 2 days, 3 days, no one had seen him. No one had heard the familiar sounds of his presence, the pacing, the muttering, the occasional cries that suggested either breakthrough or breakdown, that could be either genius or madness, that by then no one could distinguish between because they had become the same thing. 2 names for the state of consciousness pushed so far beyond normal parameters that all categories collapsed into simple fact. Tesla, alone, in room 3327, with a sign on the door saying "Do Not Disturb." It is said that when they finally entered, when the manager's key turned in the lock, and the door opened onto the space where Tesla had lived his final years in isolation that was nearly complete, in solitude that had become his only companion, they found him in a position that shocked those who knew him, that seemed impossible for the man who would not sleep, that appeared at first to be temporary arrangement but revealed itself, slowly, to be permanent. He was horizontal. This alone was extraordinary. The man who had spent decades vertical, standing or sitting, but never lying down except for those brief tour periods that were not sleep, never sleep, just rest with consciousness, maintained this man was now lying on the bed as though he had finally, after 86 years of resistance, accepted the invitation to surrender, to release, to allow the body to find the position it was meant to occupy during the hours when consciousness ceases. His eyes were closed. This detail is mentioned in every account, as though the witnesses understood its significance, as though they recognized that closed eyes meant something profound for a man whose eyes had remained open through thousands of nights, through decades of wakefulness, through the sleepless vigil that had defined his existence and destroyed it simultaneously. The room around him bore witness to his final hours. Papers covered every surface, covered in calculations that grew increasingly abstract as they progressed, that suggested a mind still working even as the body failed, still pursuing understanding even as the systems that allowed understanding collapsed, still reaching for insight that would remain forever out of reach, because the consciousness seeking it was itself dissolving, was itself finally surrendering to forces that could not be negotiated with, could not be denied any longer. That had waited patiently for decades and now, at last, claimed what they had always been owed: rest, complete rest, permanent rest. Some believe he was working until the moment of death. That the papers represented his final effort, his last attempt to solve problems that had occupied him for years, to complete theories that would remain incomplete, to achieve understanding that would elude him as it had eluded him increasingly in the decades, since clarity became confusion, since insight became delusion, since the mind that had worked so brilliantly began its slow unraveling under the weight of exhaustion that accumulated beyond any possibility of recovery. But others suggest something different, suggest that perhaps in those final hours, in those final moments, Tesla had simply stopped, had released the work that had consumed him, had let go of the theories and the calculations and the endless pursuit that had driven him through thousands of sleepless nights, had found, finally, the surrender that had eluded him for so long, the acceptance that consciousness cannot continue indefinitely, that the body's wisdom about rest was not ignorance but truth, that sleep is not the enemy but the friend he had refused, the ally he had rejected, the mercy he had denied himself until denial was no longer possible and sleep came anyway, came without permission, came as death, which is, perhaps, the final sleep, the ultimate rest. The darkness from which there is no waking, but which offers something that all the sleepless years could not: peace. Beneath the silence of that room, beneath the papers and the calculations, and the evidence of a mind that had worked until it could work no more, lived a question that can never be answered. Did Tesla find, in those final moments, what he had sought throughout his sleepless life? Or did he find something different entirely, not transcendence, but release, not victory, but surrender, not proof that consciousness can operate indefinitely, but proof that it cannot, that the body's demands are not optional, that rest comes eventually to everyone whether they accept it or resist it, whether they surrender willingly or are overcome by forces too fundamental to defy forever? Where memory fades into the uncertainty of what cannot be known, what can never be verified, we are left with this image. Tesla, horizontal at last, eyes closed finally, the restless energy that had animated him for 86 years gone quiet, the current that would not ground finally grounded, the consciousness that would not cease having ceased, leaving only the shell, the vessel, the body that had carried brilliance and madness both, that had sustained the vigil and paid the price, that lay now in the position it should have occupied every night for decades, but had been denied except in those inadequate tour periods that were not sleep, were not rest, were not enough, never enough to sustain what was being asked of it. The pigeons were visible through the window he had left slightly open. Whether this was accident or intention, Whether he had opened it to allow the birds he loved to visit one final time or whether it had simply been left open and the birds arrived by chance, we cannot know. But they were there. Witnesses to the end of the vigil, to the final rest, to the sleep that had finally come after decades of refusal, after years of resistance, after a lifetime of insisting that consciousness could continue, should continue, must continue until the moment when continuation became impossible, and the only thing left was cessation, release, the surrender that was also mercy, that was also the answer to a question Tesla never quite asked, but that his body had been asking all along. When can I rest? When will this end? When will consciousness release its grip and allow the darkness that it needs, that every biological system needs, that cannot be denied forever without the cost that Tesla paid his trembling hands, his wild eyes, his confusion, his isolation, his final decades of diminishment that followed the brilliant early years when sleeplessness seemed like advantage, seemed like the secret that would make him superhuman, seemed like the path to transcendence, but led instead to destruction. To the wreckage of a mind that worked until it broke, that continued until it couldn't, that proved not humanity's ability to transcend limitation, but limitation's ability to destroy anyone who refuses to honor it. Death is sometimes called the final sleep. But for Tesla, perhaps it was the first real one. The first time his consciousness had truly ceased, truly released, truly allowed the dissolution that sleep provides, and that he had spent his life avoiding, resisting, denying with a stubbornness that became pathology, that became compulsion, that became the thing that defined him even as it destroyed him, that made him legendary even as it made him tragic. Marked by the date January 7, 1943, marked by the room number 3327, marked by the city that had been his home and his stage and his prison, Tesla's vigil ended. Not with revelation, not with the breakthrough he had sought, not with the vindication he had craved or the recognition he had lost or the clarity he had sacrificed, but with sleep, simple sleep. The sleep that should have come every night for 86 years, but came only once, came finally, came as the ultimate surrender to the wisdom his body had been trying to teach him all along. That rest is not optional, that consciousness has limits, that the darkness is not enemy but necessity, that sleep is not weakness but the very thing that makes wakefulness sustainable, that makes human existence bearable, that allows consciousness to continue across decades without destroying itself. Some believe there is tragedy in this, that Tesla's life represents the cost of genius, the price of vision, the sacrifice required for insights that change the world. And perhaps there is truth in this interpretation. Perhaps what Tesla discovered, what he gave to humanity, was worth the personal cost he paid. Perhaps the innovations justify the suffering. Perhaps the breakthroughs balance the breakdown. But perhaps tragedy is incomplete frame. Perhaps what Tesla's life demonstrates is simpler and more profound, that the body's wisdom exceeds the mind's cleverness, that biological imperatives cannot be reasoned away, that consciousness, no matter how brilliant, exists within flesh that has its own requirements, its own non-negotiable demands, its own ancient knowledge about what is necessary for sustained operation across the decades of human lifespan. Sleep is one of those requirements, not preference, not luxury. Not the waste that Tesla believed it to be, but necessity, foundation, the practice that allows every other practice, that makes possible every other achievement, that sustains the very consciousness that must periodically cease in order to continue. Tesla refused this, believed he could operate by different rules. Proved through decades of sleeplessness that humans can survive with minimal rest, that consciousness can be sustained through will alone, that the body's demands can be deferred, minimized, reduced to 2 hours that are not really sleep at all but something less, something insufficient, something that delays collapse but does not prevent it, that allows continuation but extracts a price that becomes visible only after decades, only after the damage is complete, only after recovery becomes impossible, and the only option is to continue in diminished capacity until continuation itself becomes impossible, and the final sleep arrives unbidden, unwanted perhaps, but ultimately merciful because it ends the vigil, because it completes the circuit, because it provides the rest that was always needed, that should have been taken nightly, that comes finally as death when it was refused as sleep. The hotel room stood empty after they removed his body. The papers remained where he left them. The calculations continued across pages that would be examined by those seeking final insights, final breakthroughs, final evidence of the genius that had once burned so bright. But what they found was confusion more than clarity, calculations that led nowhere, theories that could not be tested, the evidence not of transcendent consciousness still operating at the moment of death, but of consciousness that had lost its coherence years or decades earlier, that had continued through momentum and habit more than through genuine function, that had been running on empty so long that empty had become normal, had become baseline, had become the state in which Tesla existed in his final years, not working so much as performing the ritual of working, not thinking so much as generating the appearance of thought, not conscious in any meaningful sense but unable to stop the performance of consciousness, unable to lie down, unable to close his eyes, unable to surrender until surrender was no longer choice but inevitability. And then he did surrender, did lie down, did close his eyes. And consciousness, which had insisted it could continue indefinitely, discovered what the body had known all along, that everything ends, that vigilance cannot be maintained forever, that the sleep we refuse in life comes anyway as death. That rest arrives whether we accept it or resist it, whether we welcome it or fight it to the very last moment, the very last breath, the very last firing of neurons that spent decades operating beyond their design specifications, and now, finally, mercifully cease. The sleep that finally came was not the sleep Tesla would have chosen, was not the brief, controlled rest he had allowed himself in measured doses, was not the 2 hours of consciousness-maintained vigilance that he had substituted for genuine sleep, but complete sleep, total sleep, the sleep from which there is no waking, no return, no resumption of the vigil that had consumed him, defined him, destroyed him. And perhaps though we can never know, can never verify, can only hope perhaps in that final sleep, Tesla found what he had sought throughout his sleepless life. Not transcendence of human limitation, not proof that consciousness can operate continuously, not validation of the practices that had destroyed him, but something simpler, something he had denied himself for 86 years. Something that every human needs and that his body had been begging for since long before the damage became irreversible. Peace. Peace in unconsciousness. Peace in dissolution. Peace in the darkness that asks nothing, demands nothing, judges nothing, but simply receives what consciousness can no longer carry, what the body can no longer sustain, what the self can no longer maintain against the forces that insist, finally, that enough is enough, that the vigil is over, that the work is complete not because completion was achieved, but because continuation is impossible, that rest comes now not as choice but as fate, not as surrender but as release, not as failure but as mercy. The room is empty now, the papers are archived, the calculations remain unsolved, and Tesla, who would not sleep, who could not sleep, who spent his entire adult life resisting the most basic human need, finally sleeps deeply, completely, permanently. The first real rest he had known since the days before he decided sleep was waste, before he committed to the vigil that would define his life and end it, before he made the choice that seemed like power but became prison, seemed like transcendence but became tragedy, seemed like the path to greatness, but led only to the room where he died alone, having discovered too late what the body knew from the beginning. That sleep is not optional, that rest is not weakness, that the darkness is not enemy but friend, and that those who refuse it pay a price measured not in hours but in decades, not in fatigue but in the slow destruction of everything that makes consciousness worth sustaining, until finally, mercifully, consciousness itself ceases and the sleep that was refused in life arrives as death, bringing at last the rest that should have been accepted as gift, that could have been embraced as wisdom. That comes anyway in the end because the body always wins, because biology always has the final word, because sleep, whether we take it nightly or refuse it until death comes to everyone, comes to even the most wakeful, comes as the mercy that Tesla denied himself for 86 years, but that claimed him anyway. That holds him now in the only embrace he would allow, in the only rest he could accept. The eternal sleep from which there is no waking, no working, no vigil, only the peace that passes understanding, the darkness that holds all consciousness eventually, The final rest that came to Tesla as it comes to all of us, ready or not, willing or not, having slept or having refused sleep with every ounce of will we possess, it makes no difference in the end. Sleep comes. Rest arrives. And consciousness, which insisted it could continue forever, discovers what the body knew all along. That forever is not ours to claim, that vigilance cannot be maintained indefinitely, that the sleep we need will come whether we accept it or not, whether as the nightly gift that sustains us or as the final darkness that claims us, but come it will. And when it came for Tesla, perhaps just perhaps it was kinder than he deserved, gentler than he expected, more merciful than the decades of sleeplessness that preceded it, offering at last the peace he had refused, the rest he had denied. The darkness he had feared, but that held him now with infinite patience, infinite compassion, asking nothing, forgiving everything, simply allowing him to finally, at long last, sleep. Sweet rest, Nikola Tesla. The vigil is over. The work is done. And the sleep you would not take in life has taken you at last, has granted you the mercy you denied yourself, has proven that the body's wisdom exceeds the mind's rebellion, that nature's laws cannot be negotiated with, that consciousness, no matter how brilliant, must rest, must sleep, must surrender to the darkness that you feared, but that holds you now gently, completely, offering the first real peace you have known in 86 years of wakefulness. The light is finally dim. The eyes are finally closed. The current has finally grounded. And in that grounding, in that rest, in that final surrender to the sleep that always comes eventually, perhaps there is not tragedy but completion, not failure but the fulfillment of what the body needed all along, not defeat but the victory of life over the will that tried to deny its requirements, the triumph of rest over resistance, the mercy of sleep that arrives for everyone, even for the man who would not sleep, even for consciousness that insisted it could continue forever, even for Tesla, who proved through his destruction that we are not meant to be always awake, that vigilance has its cost, and that the sleep we refuse in life becomes the sleep that claims us in death, offering, finally, mercifully, the rest that was needed all along, the darkness that should have been embraced, the peace that waits for all of us at the end of our own vigils, our own resistances, our own refusals of the simple truth that Tesla learned too late, but that we can learn from his example. That sleep is not the enemy, that rest is not weakness, and that the darkness, when we finally accept it, is not punishment but the greatest gift, the mercy that allows consciousness to finally, completely, eternally rest. Good night, Nikola Tesla. Good night.